So I'm Brendan, and Zach and Nick are here. The three of us are together because I was having a conversation with Nick, and he told me he was watching 2001. And I said, basically, good luck. You need to read the book to figure out what's going on. And then he watched the movie, and the next day we talked, and he said that he found that the music at the end was music that the title of the music was the same as one of Nietzsche's works. And he described that work and what was going on in it was some kind of an evolution. And then I posted that on Twitter. And Zach, you responded, you sent me a link. You had actually written a piece on Nietzsche in 2001.
Well, as a philosopher, I have a long-standing interest in Nietzsche, and I'm a science fiction fan. In fact, my podcast is on Star Trek and philosophy, so most of my interest in science fiction is about Star Trek, but I'm heavily influenced by 2001: A Space Odyssey, so it was just a matter of time until I was able to, combine my thoughts on Nietzsche with my enjoyment of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and hopefully draw out a few connections between the two, and hopefully we can talk about some of those today.
Yes, but I'm right in terms of that's how this. You sent a link. We got together through direct messaging, and we decided we'd all get together and do a video.
Yeah, there are so many things to discuss. Yes, I'm not sure. I can't remember if you found my blog post or if I sent it to you, one or the other. I think the interesting thing about discussions like this, from my point of view, is that, like I said, Nietzsche is kind of a mirror. You're going to read a little bit of yourself into what Nietzsche has to say. And same thing with movies. When you watch a movie, we all watch it from our own points of view and with our own experiences and our own things we find interesting or things we find inspiring or whatnot. So I'm sure we have 3 different takes on Nietzsche and 3 different takes on 2001: A Space Odyssey. So we have at least 6 directions we can go.
Okay. Well, since we've agreed to do this in the days since that, I've been mentioning Nietzsche on Twitter. And my most recent comment was, I think today, or maybe it was yesterday. And I was saying that I thought the world would have been better off if Nietzsche and Ayn Rand had taken up something else like origami. And I got a lot of responses to that. So did you see that by any chance, Zach?
I didn't. I don't hang out on social media like I used to.
Okay, well,
I'm busy. I've got a job. I don't hang out on Twitter.
Hey, I'm working. So that was a comment that got so many responses back. Most people agreed. 3 people disagreed. And a lot of people, by the way, agreed. The 3 that disagreed, 2 of them turned out to be MAGA. They were sending me things. One was sending me a thing with bullets he had in a can that if I wanted one of his bullets, I could have it. And another was, she had links on her site to things about Biden and Trump. Trump is really the president, what have you. The third person who disagreed with me on Nietzsche was just someone who read Nietzsche, liked Nietzsche, and thought Nietzsche was okay. So that's all the feedback I have.
Well, on that, before we dive into talk about 2001: A Space Odyssey, I should say right off the bat that I feel like out of the corpus of Western philosophy, Nietzsche is probably the most misunderstood of the philosophers. I think Plato you can get a hold of pretty easy. Aristotle can get a hold of pretty easily. Kant is a little wacky, but you can get a hold of what he has to say pretty easily. Nietzsche, I think people emphasize the wrong parts of Nietzsche and underemphasize the things that he really meant to say the most. So people tend to emphasize his nihilism, his view that, life is meaningless or anything objective should be sort of torn down and deconstructed, or they emphasize his will to power, which the Nazis and now maybe the MAGA folks have latched onto. But I think that really doesn't do justice to Nietzsche's overall view that most of life is about about overcoming the objective, overcoming the way in which religion or morality or Western philosophy or Western culture in general kind of makes us weak and herd-like for the sake of being a stronger, more robust individual. But as I read Nietzsche, I read it much more in an artistic sense. He wants us to be more like artists, writing and creating our own lives rather than, Nazis or rather than MAGA folks. So I really think people have kind of, they've latched on to certain parts of Nietzsche, the deconstructive part, and they've latched onto this exertiveness. But what Nietzsche means by that is not political. It's not in terms of like raw power, physical power. It's more of a creative power to distinguish yourself from the herd, to be a radically authentic individual with radical artistic creativity, and to take ownership of your own life in that way. I sound like Tony Robbins talking about Nietzsche here. but I think that's what Nietzsche means, So I think people they've latched onto the first two parts, but for Nietzsche, those are still like preliminary steps that get you to being a more authentic, more creative, more free individual, in the sense of free to be fully autonomous and fully authentic and fully creative.
Well, I haven't read much of Nietzsche, and I read the piece you sent, the PDF, which was 8 pages. And before that, it's been over 50 years since I've read anything from Nietzsche. But I did read a bunch of commentary on Nietzsche in the last couple of days. And I also read a little bit on his history. On the piece that you sent, that I don't remember the title, I'm sure you do.
Yeah, it was called On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. It was an unpublished work of his, one of his early unpublished works. Yeah.
Okay, so when I read that, and I'm coming to that cold, right? I don't have any preconceptions. Mm-hmm. It reminded me of, that's Zach in the background behind me. It reminded me of conversations I had with patients I worked with in psychiatric hospitals. And I thought it reminded me of psychotic talk.
Psychotic talk?
Yes.
What do you mean by that? I promise we're going to get around to talking about the movie, but what do you mean by psychotic talk?
You never know. I spent a lot of time working in psychiatric institutions with chronic mentally ill people. And when I read that paper, his words, the way he used words, reminded me of a number of conversations I had with people in psychiatric institutions. It wasn't like he made a reference to something someone else made a reference to. It was just the way it sounded to me. Granted, I was reading it, but it just reminded me of that. And then when I started reading up on Nietzsche in the last couple of days, apparently he died, and prior to his death, he became incapacitated, mentally incapacitated, and he was debate whether he died of eventually of syphilis or he died of some kind of a cerebral.
I actually have this theory, and I don't think I'm the only one to have it, but I'm not a historian per se, so I don't know all the ins and outs of Nietzsche's life. It's kind of tangential to the philosophy for its own sake. But given what Nietzsche basically had to say about being the author of your own life, there's a part of me that suspects Nietzsche went mad on purpose as a way to demonstrate how to free yourself from all the constraints of Western society, almost like a cynic used to do in ancient Greece, like the cynic movement in ancient philosophy. Just radical separation from all the accepted norms and all the social conventions. And I think Nietzsche probably was happy to go mad.
Well,
even in his terrible loneliness that he talked about.
You're giving a definition of psychosis.
Happy to be mad?
No, just going off, losing contact, breaking away from the rest of it. But I just mentioned that because when I read the work that you sent, it just reminded me, brought to mind a number of conversations.
Well, in that work, and this is a good segue to talk about the movie, I think at a certain point. Nietzsche's basic claim is that we've mistaken the subjective for the objective. You know, we always look at the world from our own perspectives, from our own with our own motivations, with our own drives and desires, which are all deeply animalistic and tied up with the kinds of beings we are, the kinds of stuff you see at the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in fact, in that piece, he calls humans clever beasts who invented knowing to preserve our existence a little longer. And that's very harmonious with what you see in the movie. But Nietzsche's basic claim is that we have this subjective window into reality, and all of our concepts of truth and knowledge and morality and justice, religion, anything that smacks of objectivity is really just our little human, either human species specific window into reality, or it's our own individual window into reality that we've somehow mistaken for objectivity and taken to be the yardstick of all of reality, because it's our window into reality, when forgetting that it's deeply metaphorical and deeply subjective and deeply individualistic and even deeply tied to us as the kinds of beings we are, the kinds of beings that somehow invented knowing as a way of preserving our existence in a world that's fundamentally harsh to us.
There's a series of books that when I was teaching, I used to recommend. I was working with Nikki, just mentoring and stuff. I recommend those Castaneda's books. Carlos Castaneda wrote a series of books. The first one was his second part of the book was his doctoral dissertation in anthropology, and he was spending time out in the West with a Yaqui shaman, Juan. When you're talking about the way you just described it and what Nietzsche described in the piece I read is similar to what Juan is talking about, but very different, because Nietzsche, I find Nietzsche, I'm really being arrogant here, but my limited exposure to Nietzsche, he takes no responsibility for what he says.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I what's hard with Nietzsche is separating the substance from the style, because he's trying to write in a way that is consistent with his overall view. So he doesn't just write a treatise in a logical order. He writes poetry. He doesn't write an article in a nice linear, orderly fashion. He writes aphorisms to get you to think about these things. So some of this is intentional stylistic maneuvers, I think, to get us, the readers, to actually think about these things for ourselves and not to connect all the dots for us.
Either that, or when people like us are exposed to Nietzsche, we start overlaying on top of Nietzsche what our needs are in terms of reality perception.
Oh, and we all definitely do that. And how could it be otherwise, right? If Nietzsche's right that it all is subjectivity and our own metaphors and our own individual interpretations and just our own perspectives, what else could we do but take anything we read and lay ourselves right on top of it?
Okay, then I think that's what's happening with a lot of folks with Nietzsche. I think the same thing happens with Ayn Rand.
That's why the Nazis could latch on to Nietzsche and go, Nietzsche's our guy, because they just read what they wanted to read into it. Sure.
But with that Nazism, that isn't there? I mean, I know you said you weren't a historian. My understanding of Nietzsche in his later life, when he became incapacitated, was that his sister took over a large part of his intellectual estate and actually served to kind of manipulate some of his philosophy, which I think allowed the Nazis to latch onto it much more than
yeah, sure. Well, she became a Nazi, and she was the one who controlled his writings and his estate and whatnot. Right. In fact, the book that people, one book of Nietzsche's that people commonly know is Will to Power, which is not a book he ever published. His sister took some of his writings, edited them, and put them together into a book that we now call Will to Power, which is one of Nietzsche's concepts, without a doubt. But, I think the emphasis on it, I would say politically in the context of Nazism, really did a huge disservice to how people interpret Nietzsche and which parts of Nietzsche get prominence.
But Nietzsche,
I think it's particularly sad, especially as I understand Nietzsche, he was an intense critic of ideology in all of its forms. I understood him to always rail against what I guess you could call it the totalitarianism of rationality, and that he thought that to some extent to base yourself solely on and intellectual pursuit was very problematic because it wasn't grounded in any sort of morality. And obviously we saw that play out in the Nazis. And I think one parallel we might actually see to that in 2001 is the computer, right? Because the computer to some extent is a manifestation of rationality and intellectualism at its highest extent, to the extent that it was. And what that permitted was the computer to kill people, people frozen, people just launching them out of spaceships, all in the name of a mission. And so I think that when you really start to look at Nietzsche, at least from my perspective, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and some of his other works, you really get to see Nietzsche kind of riddled throughout this entire movie.
I think I'm speculating a bit here, but I think in terms of Nietzsche and totalitarianism, I think he would likely give the same critique of it that he gives about Western morality in general, which is that it's largely reactive. You know, he has this kind of interesting historical analysis where he says, you know, Judeo-Christian morality arose historically because Jews were historically a slave race. And so they invented morality as a way of inverting the power relationships. You know, they can moralize now and take the moral high ground in a way that they couldn't take the political high ground. And I think he would say the whole notion of totalitarianism is largely based in resentment and reactiveness, in the same way that he would think that Western morality in general is based on resentment and reactiveness. You know, it's a way of exerting yourself. There's will to power there, but it's not the most authentic way of exerting yourself. There's better ways to exert yourself than to become a totalitarian and to subdue others' individuality at the same time. So,
right.
I can't imagine. You know, again, it's interesting because on the one hand, I feel like I'm an expert because I've been reading Nietzsche, you know, for literally decades now at this point. On the other hand, I certainly gravitate towards the parts of Nietzsche that I find the most interesting, and political philosophy has never really been my strong suit, never been my strongest interest. So I've never honestly thought much about Nietzsche and totalitarianism until you raised the question. But I do think what Nietzsche really doesn't like is reactiveness and resentment, because he finds them a sign of weakness, right? You know, he thinks the really strong individuals are the ones who can not be reactive, not be resentful, can exert themselves in a really authentic way without merely stomping on other people. So I would say just like nihilism for him is a kind of a necessary stage that has to happen to overcome the past. Like you overcome objectivity by deconstructing it all and by being somewhat nihilistic, but that's an intermediate stage that comes before finding subjective meaning in your own life and your own creativity and your own interpretations and whatnot. I would say Nietzsche would probably say something similar about totalitarianism. Like maybe it's an intermediate stage that we have to go through politically, but it's definitely something to be transcended because it's not the most authentic way of being.
Right.
One of the things that struck me is I don't think Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001, was telling the same story that Kubrick was telling in the production of 2000 and direction of 2001. I think Kubrick introduced Nietzsche to 2001.
Oh, that's almost certainly true. I mean, I've read The Sentinel, which is the short story that 2001 Space Odyssey is based on. That was Arthur C. Clarke's, you know, germ of the idea for 2001. You don't find much Nietzsche in it. Really, you don't. I mean, insofar as it's evolutionary in nature, it's almost Nietzschean by default. And Nietzsche was a huge fan of Darwin. You know, I thought that the evolutionary history of how our consciousness evolved and its role that it played in the preservation of our species, and the way in which we kind of put it on a pedestal and forgotten about these other aspects of humanity. You know, there's an evolutionary history to be told about the kind of beings we are and how we got to be so-called rational and why we put it on a pedestal and why we prioritize it over other aspects of our human life. So I would say insofar as even that germ of the idea is invoking the evolutionary history of man and our consciousness and our progress into the future, it's kind of Nietzschean by default. But I don't know if that was intentional by Arthur C. Clarke, but I think I don't know, because I watched 2001 A Space Odyssey when I was a kid, and I've watched it many times since, long before I considered myself a philosopher. And I think when I see the movie with fresh eyes, not bringing the philosophy to it, it's an interesting story about a revolutionary history. It's a thought experiment. It's certainly hopeful. Like, it shows that we're headed somewhere into the future. I don't think it romanticizes technology at all. It's really critical of technology. Like, there's the bit about Hal going crazy. Everything about contemporary life in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the life of 2001, is kind of bland and boring and structured and gray and not very interesting. And so there's definitely kind of a critical, a critique, for lack of a better word, of modernity and modernism and progress and all of the sort of technological progressiveness in the I would say, I don't know how far back to stretch this, but at least from the Enlightenment into with its strong emphasis on rationality and logic and whatnot. I would say that it's a deep critique of us as rational beings. It doesn't seem to glamorize it at all. It seems to just paint it in a pretty boring light, honestly. You play this boring game of chess with Hal, and Frank Poole is kind of bored when he's talking to his parents or listening to the recordings of the happy birthday message. No one smiles very much. And, Haywood Floyd, he's in this gray space station where everything's gray except for the chairs, which are really colorful for some reason. No one, when he's talking to his daughter, he's by this awesome video phone thing, he's kind of unaffected by it all. It's a cool, an emotionally cool look at what human relations are like and what our relation to the world is like and what it's like to be technological with all these amazing wonders going on. It's not a very happy place to be, it seems like. So it doesn't paint rationality in a very strong light.
I just want to jump back to something. Nietzsche may not have intended to be used by people like the Nazis, but he certainly was capable of being used by someone like the Nazis. If, just for the record, I am not a member of any religion. At best, I'm an agnostic. I have no idea whether there's a God or there isn't a God, and I don't spend a lot of time with it. But you couldn't take, for instance, any of the New Testament accounts of Jesus Christ and with ease use them as an underpinning for Nazi philosophy.
That would be quite a stretch, yes.
Yes, but not so with Nietzsche.
I think with Nietzsche, I'm trying to give the most general account I can here because I think it's broadly extensible. It relates to religion, it relates to politics, it relates to this line of thread about totalitarianism. I think one thing Nietzsche really doesn't like in many of his writings all over the place is any kind of escapism. So, religion for a lot of people is a kind of escapism. Oh, just I'll get my rewards in the afterlife. And, you get kind of subdued in the actual life because you're so worried about the afterlife, and people can use you and manipulate you, and you can kind of water your personality down and be objective and moral and good and pacified. But, that's a kind of escapism. Like, oh, I'm not going to worry about my real life because I got this reward in the afterlife. Same thing with any kind of political philosophy. Oh, we don't need to worry about the present because I've got some ideology that's guiding me towards whatever in the future, right? So you don't have to, I don't think he's a fan of ideology in general in that way. So I think, certainly you can use some of Nietzsche's concepts like will to power and whatnot. But I think anything that kind of distracts you from, I would say the present, not the present moment in some fluffy sense, but the kind of being you are. You're an individual, a biological being, not just some disembodied Cartesian ego, floating in some religious heaven somewhere. You're here right now in this world, and you've got needs and drives and desires and things you want to accomplish and mountaintops you set your eyes upon and really want to reach someday. But we get subdued politically and by religion and by culture and by rationality and by just everything that he would consider herd-like in our behavior in our society. And so for him, you've heard this concept of the Übermensch being someone who can transcend all of that, who's not constrained by those things. It can be radically free to be, the strong individual that they are. But I don't think it's clear to me, Nietzsche never meant it in any kind of totalitarian sense. It was,
I'm not making a claim he did. I'm stating a fact. that one of the most totalitarian regimes, one of the most brutal
Mhm.
regimes we've had in our lifetime, used him as an underpinning for what they were doing.
And I wasn't really aware of the fact that the MAGA movement seems to have latched onto Nietzsche as well. I mean, I first heard of it was when you mentioned your Twitter responses.
First, I heard of it as well. I just found it interesting. They always latch on to Ayn Rand. You know, her libertarianism underpinned much of the. Go ahead.
It's funny you say that, because I think this is something that's important to Nietzsche. What people who are power hungry do, because we are power hungry individuals, you know, we we all have drives, you know, he's like the first psychologist. We all have these subconscious drives and desires that push us, and a lot of it is power based. And what we do is co-opt things. We you know, if you're trying to get political clout, if you can get rationality on your side, so much the better, right? So if you can claim to be more, you know, if you can get right on your side and morality on your side and objectivity on your side and all the great philosophers on your side too, then hey, that's just one extra step along this ladder to climb the, you know, ladder to increase your power. So I think a lot of that is just just outright co-opting. Just, you know, if you can get people going, oh, this person's citing Nietzsche, so he must really know what he's talking about, or this person's claiming to be logical, or claiming to be objective, or claiming to be rational, or claiming to be moral, that it really does move people up the political ladder in ways that are highly manipulative, I would say.
And I think one of the examples of that you could, I think it's most famous in Nietzsche is his quote that God is dead. And I think that's often missed.
And we have killed him.
Yeah, we have killed him. What water do we have to wash this blade? Because I think, like, for instance, one of the things that the Nazis did is they would take the sentiment behind that quote, and the sentiment that they imputed behind that quote, to justify an atheistic sort of worldview. And the problem with that is that I don't think Nietzsche was really saying that with that quote. I think what he was really talking about is how, because of our emphasis on rationality, because of a lot of the ideas we got from the Enlightenment, we have killed the worldview, one of which being Judeo-Christian belief system, that gave us some rooting in morality for how to conduct ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that we see manifest in 2001: A Space Odyssey through Hal. And going back to what I was saying earlier, that he is able to justify killing pretty much the entirety of the crew in the name of a mission. And that's something that I think Nietzsche was touching on, that is permissible when you start to kill off, through the scientific method, through rationality, all the belief systems that underpin our conduct.
What did Nietzsche offer up as an alternative or an aspiration?
You know, he didn't. That's the thing. Yeah.
Huh?
So he didn't. That's the thing. You know, in terms of
when you take everything away, right? When you negate everything, when you say everything is basically nothing, it's only what you ascribe to it, right? Then you're saying that you're the whole universe. And if you're the whole universe, it's going to be an empty universe you're in. It doesn't.
Well, yeah.
It doesn't
I mean,
talk about your responsibility to other creatures in the universe that you're sharing it with.
There's so much to say there, and yet I'm not sure quite how to respond, because I mean, certainly Nietzsche has no love for any objective system of morality or objective rationality in general. Doesn't seem to thrill him. He thinks all of it is weak-like and herd-like. So what do you do if you take all that away? And I think what Nietzsche would say about the rationality thread is that we've kind of replaced God with things like the state or progress or rationality. The entire Enlightenment movement is a kind of secular replacement for the role that God served in people's lives when people were largely more religious. You know, and so now we've got this, you know, fairly secular society, but we still have the vestiges of morality, and we have the kind of the lingering vestiges of Judeo-Christian morality in our assumptions about morality and politics and what society means and what its role is and whatnot, all of which is still kind of reactive and herd-like for Nietzsche. So what do you do when you take all that away? I mean, the immediate thing is and this is where people I think get stuck with Nietzsche, because it's not clear what the road ahead is then. So if you take all that away, I mean, immediately you go, Well, there has to be, because Nietzsche himself wasn't a fan of nihilism. He thought that what happens when you destroy all that, you get nihilism. Nothing matters. There's no meaning, whatnot. And he himself said nihilism is something to be overcome in some subjective way, not in, not, you don't want to get stuck in nihilism saying that nothing matters and there's no meaning and just pure
Nietzsche
deconstruction.
Left us with nothing in that regard. In fact, the end of his life was absolutely nothing.
I would disagree completely. I don't think Nietzsche left with that. I think he said pretty explicitly, the way you overcome this is through, he basically says it in, let's say, I'm trying to remember if it's in that essay that I sent on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. It might be in the Gay Science. I'd have to look it up. But he basically says this is the role that art serves. People create. I write plays. I write blog posts. You make paintings. So and so makes music, and together we interpret the world in our own ways. We don't do it objectively. We don't say my interpretation should be yours. You have your interpretation in your art. I've got my interpretation in my art. And together we can talk about how interesting our interpretations are, but we don't need that objective perspective.
Does he offer anything in the way of responsibility to other humans?
I would add on to what Zach said, and I think this might get to your point, Brendan, in that when we first started our conversation, I was teasing out a parallel that I saw between the progression that Nietzsche offers up in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and the overall 2001 Space Odyssey story. And so as I thought about this more, it became a bit more clear to me. So for instance, as Thus Spoke Zarathustra plays out, it's a prince goes down to a village and he starts to talk with all these villagers there about the Übermensch. And one of the quotes that the prince says to them is, "What is ape compared to man?" Right? And then what he's saying there is, what is man compared to the Übermensch? And sure enough, 2001: A Space Odyssey opens up with apes and then man. And then ultimately what I would say is analogous to, at least if you're looking at it from a Nietzschean perspective, the Übermensch. And so when you drill down on this even more, you see Nietzsche come out with a sort of three-step progression of man starting out as a camel, a beast, a bird, in which to some extent maybe the Voyagers in 2001: A Space Odyssey start out as, because they have the burden of carrying on this mission, right? And so then what you see, at least in Nietzsche's progression, is that you transition from the camel, the beast of burden, to a lion. And the lion is essentially a creature which just disaffirms all of the conventions and expectations upon it. And you see this transition when, I forget the character's name, but I think it was Dave, he kills Hal. So Hal is sort of the expectation of society that he will go on and carry the mission and do what he ought to do. Well, Hal becomes a lion and slays that thing, which parallels Nietzsche's transitionary point between the lion and the child, where you slay the dragon of thou shalt. And the dragon of thou shalt has gold scales all over it, each one with a commandment. And then finally, after you do that, you start to become a child. And a child is the first affirmative sort of being in that progression, in that it may participate in a lot of the things that, for instance, the camel did. It may still enact a lot of those behaviors, but now it's doing it from a place not of expectation and convention and guilt and pressure, but because, kind of like a child, it's experiencing it freshly and doing it because it wants to. And so when it comes to, I think, your point, Brendan, about, well, what did Nietzsche offer up in terms of responsibility? I think what Nietzsche was saying in that progression is that it's on us to become responsible to ourselves and find a way to progress such that we can participate in all these things that the world has to offer in a positive and affirmative sense.
Can you just give me the reference for that last sentence? Which work of Nietzsche did he say we do this so that we can participate in a positive sense?
I mean, that's my spin on the ending of Buschi.
I'm asking for a citation.
I can't provide, not off the top of my head.
How about you, Zach?
No, not off the top of my head, no.
I don't think it's there. I think if you look at, it takes people in our lifetime.
It's an interesting take on it though, Nick, that, maybe the world wouldn't look all that different really. We would still get up and have breakfast. We'd still have jobs. We'd still do all the things we do, but there's a difference between doing them out of expectation or doing them, in a way that waters down who you are and makes it less authentic. And there's a way of doing the very same actions more authentically because you really want to, right? And so maybe the world wouldn't look all that different. Although I don't know if that's how Nietzsche describes it, because, I think he really thinks that a great many aspects of Western culture and society and modern life really are vestiges of this lingering herd-like watered down shadow of humanity that we've inherited, compared to the glories of humans past who were more exertive, and when that radical individuality was more praised. The way you're describing it still sounds like kind of tempering yourself, and I don't think Nietzsche likes the tempering yourself for the sake of getting along with others necessarily.
Were the glories of humans past? Was that Rome?
Yeah, he loved ancient Rome and ancient Greece, at least not like the turn of Western philosophy, but like pre-Socratic thinkers. And when in fact he was a huge fan of Dionysus, right? The Dionysian cult, because he liked the revelry, just delighting in life versus trying to rein in our impulses with morality, or with like Aristotle's emphasis on moderation. Nietzsche just thought was a terrible move for the human spirit. He doesn't want moderation. He wants you to revel in things.
Ancient Rome was a fascist state.
Yeah, and I think he really was fond of Julius Caesar, actually.
Back to Nietzsche and Nazism.
Yeah, you can see why you could go that way with Nietzsche. Although I think at every turn when Nietzsche does that, he immediately takes it in an artistic direction and not in a political direction. So
would you say that Nietzsche was a hedonist to some extent? Zach?
I think he wanted to be, honestly. No, I don't know if he was. One of the things I really like about Nietzsche, and in fact, this is one little tiny thing about 2001: A Space Odyssey that I really thought was interesting. I rewatched it today, and I found this interesting in the moment. I don't know if it's a real connection or not, but Nietzsche was fascinated by food. He thought, in fact, he even called German culture and German philosophy indigestion. So he thought that we don't eat high quality enough food. We tend to, diet too much, or be a vegetarian too much, rather than just eating our fill, because we're biological beings that like food. So he was constantly talking about food, but using it as a metaphor for his own ideas. He would say things like, once once you understand once you can digest my ideas, they'll agree with you too. He's constantly using food metaphors to talk about his own ideas and digestion. And again, reinforcing the notion that we're biological beings. We're not just sort of minds imprisoned in these bodies. But in 2001: A Space Odyssey, when they show the first show the spaceship, and Dr. Floyd is on his way to the moon, he's sipping his food from the little straws, the little space food packets. He's take a sip of corn, take a sip of the peas. I was just thinking that's such a terrible commentary on what modern life would be like, where we have to sip our food out of this unsatisfying, bland looking, pea soup out of these terrible packets, out of these, disgusting straws, compared to like living, real gastronomy, real cooking, real living, real being in the moment. It's just another way that Kubrick squeezes in that modern life is not necessarily full of virtues with all of its conveniences and wonders. So I don't think Nietzsche would like the way we treat food these days, and I don't think he'd like what he saw in 2001: A Space Odyssey either.
When you're describing that last description, 2001, Brave New World is a description of a dystopian society, right? But you get this sense from reading Orwell that he cares, that his writing about it is not a celebration of it, and could not be misinterpreted as a celebration of it. It's a critique of it. I don't know, not having read Nietzsche.
Yeah, again, I think, but I don't want to interrupt, but I think the emphasis on the reason people take Nietzsche the wrong way is that they don't read the other parts of Nietzsche, right? One of Nietzsche's books, like for example, is a subtitle, "A Book for Free Spirits." Right? He does kind of provide the recipe that he thinks people should follow, and he basically thinks that the people of his own time are largely going to ignore him because he wasn't widely read in his own day. In fact, he complained. He said, the people, it's up to them. If they don't want to learn anything from me, that's fine. So he did spell out lots of things, I think.
What is he offering up in terms of constraining yourself?
I don't understand the question. What do you mean by constraining yourself?
Do you understand that, Nick?
I mean, in terms of constraining yourself, I think he offers up quite a bit in the sense that he doesn't want you to constrain yourself to, I guess, lazy thinking and ideologies and those things that would allow you to kind of not be your most authentic self. I mean, you know, one of the quotes that I like from Nietzsche is that he said I might be misquoting this a bit, but he said there were two great narcotics in our history: alcohol and Christianity. And I think
he said that in his autobiography, if memory serves.
Yeah. And I think what he was saying with that is that, like alcohol, like Christianity, it allows you to sort of check out from yourself, to not really get in touch with what you think about something, what you feel about something, and doesn't permit you, even though some people might disagree with this take, at least when it comes to alcohol, an authentic self-expression of how you're really feeling. And so when it comes to constraining yourself, I think Nietzsche was about, even though he wasn't a fan of, you know, moderation, I think he was to some extent about conducting yourself in such a way and having a belief system of such that you are able to express your authentic self. I think kind of like maybe a lot of the psychoanalysts that came out of him, he was of the belief that the ultimate measure of man is the individual, not the group or anything like that. And so to the extent that you conduct yourself in a way that allows you to be who you are, whoever that might be, Nietzsche was fine.
I think at every turn, in fact, when one of his poems, I don't remember it off the top of my head, I could look it up, but it's in one of his poems, which is in the sort of preliminary section to his book, The Gay Science. He basically talks about being always above the crowd, you know, just no matter what group you're part of, you should always be above it. You should never be part of it. Even if you're in the crowd, you should be above the crowd.
When Nick and I first met, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick was an atheist.
Okay.
And he told me he was an atheist. And I said, what's the difference between you and a deist? And he said, well, I don't believe in God. I said, well, they believe in God, but please explain to me what the difference is between someone who has a really firm belief in God and someone who has a firm belief in no God. Me, I don't know. You know what I'm saying? There's a song, I can't remember I'm always posting it up on Twitter. Maybe you remember it, Nikki. Let the mystery be. Yeah. So I see those two schools as they're in the same, you know, they're in the same boat. They're wedded to the same kind of things. They're not really free thinkers in my sense of the word. I don't know where Nietzsche is. I kind of think he'd be in one of those. Maybe he's in the atheist school, or
Nietzsche's definitely an atheist. He has no love for God or Christianity, for sure. That, you know, that's unambiguous in his work.
Okay, but one of my critiques of atheists is they're very dogmatic. They know something they can't know.
I think that, again, there's a danger of misinterpreting Nietzsche here. There really is. And this is I think the common mistake a great many people make when reading Nietzsche is they forget these other parts of Nietzsche. So they'll say, oh yeah, Nietzsche's an atheist, but that's not what he's not doing there, is giving an answer. He's not giving a metaphysical theory about the nature of reality and rejecting God. He's giving his own take on it. And what he does, he always reminds us how specific of a being we are. I mean, he says, like in The Gay Science, he talks at length about how, you know, every time we learn something, every time we think we've got some great achievement, we feel good, we feel secure, we feel safe in this world that's really kind of harsh to us. But at the same time, we're kind of like a caged in lion. You know, we have this great potential, but we're living inside this prison that we put around ourselves, prison of morality or religion or objectivity or rationality. And so part of it is freeing ourselves from all of that. But then he says at the same time, you know, we're still just one kind of being, you know, we're a biological being, like just like the lion, or just like the, you know, the apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is definitely a Nietzschean thread. You know, and in fact, I think in that article that I sent you, on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, he basically says the gnat flies through the air with the same solemnity that we do when we come up with an idea. You know, we view ourselves as the center of creation with our own rationality and our morality and all of our great achievements and whatnot, all the things that come up in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Look at all this progress humanity has had. But at the same time, we're not the center of creation, you know? In fact, he says in that article, our star is going to cool and congeal one day, and we clever beasts are going to die. And so much for humanity, right? So much for our rationality, so much for our morality. It's not as important as we mere humans like to think that it is. And yet we've somehow put it on a pedestal and made it the measure of the man.
I'm just trying to glean something here. What is he deriving meaning from? And I'm asking this in the context of, it seems like he's saying it all means nothing anyway.
Well, he is. In any objective sense, he is saying that. But the very next thing has to be, but you can find lots of subjective meaning yourself.
In Castaneda things, I used to assign that. Juan, who's a shaman, okay, he takes Carlos Castaneda through a series of things, and he talks about two things: becoming a warrior, becoming a man of knowledge. And simplest, and I'll stop, to become a warrior, you have to get past your own fear. To become a man of knowledge, you need to get past your own fear as well. And the way you get past fear is through gaining clarity. And so that's the first step, the first hurdle for someone who's aspiring on either of those paths. The second step is to get past the arrogance that you gain from assuming you understand things, from the clarity. So
well, for Nietzsche, again, for Nietzsche, there is no such thing as understanding, because all we're doing is truth for him. The whole notion of knowledge and truth for him is deeply metaphorical. You know, every time, you know, if you do a math problem on the board, 2 + 2 = 4, you might say, well, I've got something universal there. I understand something. I've got some knowledge. It's like, no, you've got metaphors. You've never seen the number 2. You've counted things. You've seen, you know, 2 apples and 2 lions and two of this and 2 of that. But you don't, you know, the whole notion of the number 2 is just our kind of human projection onto this more real, sensuous reality that we live in. So anything that smacks of objectivity, he's just going to write off as, you know, mere metaphor, mere perspective, mere whatever. Yeah.
Contrasted with this, when Juan is talking to Carlos Castaneda, just Carlos, he tells him there's the Noggle, and the Noggle is chaos, and the universe is chaos, and there is no meaning in it, nothing. It's just chaos. Right. And then he says, what we do as humans is we create the tonal. And he says the tonal is really the island of the tonal. It's a construct we create for ourselves so that we're not scared to death.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, because this is probably one of the most Nietzschean things in 2001: A Space Odyssey. The notion that these apes essentially live in what you might call a, you know, kind of Thomas Hobbes state of nature. It's, you know, it's nasty, brutish, and short. It's not a happy existence. They're starving. They're trying to get water. They're killing each other. You know, it's just a terrible existence, right? And then what happens? That, you know, that because of the, you know, unseen action of the monolith, you know, however that's supposed to work, it inspires this ape to have tools to you know, it's like this rational spark, like, oh, it's like, I understand cause and effect now. I can grab this thing and I can bonk something over the head with it and I can eat more. Oh, you know, it's like the spark of rationality lies in this, you know, in this violent impulse to preserve our own existence a little bit longer and to one up our neighbor. And I think Nietzsche would say all of our rationality is like that. That's all we've ever done, is to try to preserve our existence a little longer and try to exert ourselves a little more than our neighbor. And we couch it in terms of morality. We couch it in terms of rationality. We couch it in terms of culture. But there's this deep, deep drive to one up everyone else that is driving all of it.
In 2001, when you first see the apes, there's no drive like that.
No, yeah, they're just animals living in the wild. Happy. Yeah.
So
I don't know if they're happy. They're starving, right? I don't
know. They're not looking stressed.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Like, you could read it 2 ways. Like I read it more like Thomas Hobbes would, like life is kind of nasty, brutish, and short. You know, it's a war of everyone against everyone. There's not enough to eat. There's not enough to drink. You're always worried about being killed. You could read it a little more like a little more pastoral. Like there's like a primitive society where the little ape families are living peaceably with themselves. And, you know, it's not totally clear which direction to take it.
Okay, but
you know, I took it more to like Thomas Hobbes, but I hear you taking it a little more like, hey, this is maybe kind of an ideal state, that maybe we've deviated away from in some way.
Well, I think in the movie 2001,
Mm-hmm.
what I see is the appearance or the appearance of the monolith, right? The introduction of the monolith changes the nature of that species.
Yeah,
So,
it makes us what we see when we flash forward into the future without that initial spark, which is violent, right? Without
Right.
that initial spark, we would never have become modern man. And that's a very Nietzschean idea. Yeah.
But we might not have become violent man.
We
And
might
we
have been
might
blinked
not-
out of existence because that leopard might have won.
Well, but my point in terms of 2001 is we have an evolving species on this planet. Okay, I'm looking at it as science fiction, right? And an alien species introduces itself to that, and that changes us.
That cultivates us in some way, like it grooms us to be more rational, more contemporary, more
More
modern,
violent?
more something, more violent. Well, that's it. This is something that doesn't come up in 2001 so much because the world is fairly peaceful. You know, it's a kind of a bland world. And Nietzsche talks about the way in which our conceptual life is kind of like watered down sensual impulses. Like we have this rich, vivid, sensual life we live in, and we water it down into mere concepts. And it's kind of bleak and bland compared to the sensuality of the world around us. So the future in 2001 is kind of bland, really. But in 2010, the sequel, which was also written by Arthur C. Clarke, you know, the world is at war. It's like right smack in the middle of the Cold War. The United States is about to, you know, launch a nuclear strike on Russia or vice versa. If you remember that movie. And it's exactly like what you see at the beginning of 2001. Here we are again, about to blow each other to smithereens. We haven't learned a damn thing, even despite all of this progress and all of this technology. And just, it's another way to say, you know, I think how to put this, we view ourselves as kind of the pinnacle of creation. And this is Nietzsche's fundamental critique of modernity. We view all of history as leading up to us, maybe definitely modern man, but maybe the United States in particular. but really, we're just as warlike. We're just as savage. We're just as unscrupled as we've ever been, you know, after millions of years. In fact, there's a quote, I wrote it down. It's the only quote I wrote down to bring today. I have a bunch, and I'm not going to bother, you know, boring everyone. Just go read Nietzsche yourself. You don't need me to read it to you. But there's this one phrase from the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's this: "You've made your way from worm to human, and much in you is still worm." We've forgotten our evolutionary history. We've forgotten that we're still biological beings. We forgot we still have all these drives and impulses, and we've not transcended it, and maybe we never will. But I think Nietzsche thinks we really can transcend it in some way. The Übermensch, or what he calls future philosophers, who can free themselves from this crutch of rationality and morality and objectivity.
There's a book, I think,
with its false face to mask all these aspects of our lives that we don't like to admit to.
Was Dragons of Eden. I'm not sure if I think that was the title, but it's not, it's a science book. And it's talking about the evolution of the human brain. And it talks about three key things in the evolution of the brain. When I was reading the piece you recommended, some of what he was saying sort of was similar to that. But it's a different kind of understanding of evolution. It's not just our egos getting in there, right? It's the structure. Our actual structure has changed, and as a result, what we think and see and do is different.
I guess, you know, with Nietzsche and the evolution of our rationality, this is a really interesting thread in Nietzsche, and I'm not sure we're really going to nail it in this discussion here. I'm not sure I even fully understand it, honestly. But I think he would say the same thing about rationality as he does about morality that we talked about earlier. It's based in fear, right? We are fundamentally biological beings in a world, we're relatively weak creatures. We don't have teeth and claws and fangs and, you know, but what we did invent, somehow we managed to invent rationality. We could outsmart the animals that were trying to kill us. And but that stems from this latent fear that we have about our own existence and our place in the universe and our relation to each other and our relation to other beings. And all of this massive edifice, in fact, in the gay science, he calls it a columbarium. Like these grand edifices we've built of rationality and culture and whatnot, are really rooted in these seeds of fear, to preserve our existence just a little bit longer in a world that's fundamentally harsh to us. And what we've done is forgotten that. And we tend to place rationality on a pedestal as the defining characteristic of humanity, rather than as something that had an evolutionary history and something that served a biological function in the evolutionary world, and something that maybe even waters our innate natures down a bit. And this is the part that Nietzsche worries about, our individual spirits being watered down because of rationality.
I'm not sure that we have the same definition of rationality.
Yeah, I don't know what definition you're looking for, but I mean,
well,
anything
I'm
smacking
not
of logic or objective principles or theories of morality or, metaphysical worldviews, any of that stuff. He finds some combination he finds it escapist and he finds it herd-like.
I was asking you about Wittgenstein because, or Wittgenstein, I can
It's Wittgenstein, yeah, in German, yeah.
Wittgenstein, because that was his thing. We just, the problems we have is we use language improperly, right?
Yeah, we take language out of its context, out of its meaningful context, and try to be overly general with it and kind of miss the mark in terms of the features of language that give language meaning in the first place for Wittgenstein.
Well, he's saying that we ask the wrong questions.
Or we ask them in ways that are outside the meaningful context that gave them meaning in the first place. We try to ask overly general, overly broad questions rather than being so deeply immersed in a particular culture or context, or what you would call a language game.
I guess, I don't know what rationality is. If
well, it depends. If for Aristotle, it was a matter of classifying and making distinctions and being, in terms of morality, it was a matter of finding the middle ground between opposing vices, and that's being rational, right? And coming together and solving practical problems. That was rationality for someone like Aristotle, right? And Nietzsche comes along and says, no, all of that is weak and herd-like, and ignores all this, evolutionary history of who we are, and ignores our perspectives, ignores our subconscious drives and desires. So what are you left with? And Nietzsche's only answer is, well, rationality is making your individual, you Brandon, you Nick, and me Zach, our own interpretations. That's what it is to be rational. That's the end of the story for Nietzsche. If you're looking for a more objective answer than that, you're not going to find it in Nietzsche, I think.
Yeah. And I think that tracks along, Brendan, with what you were saying earlier about Castaneda. I mean, I've read those books, so I haven't
read that, by the way. So
okay, so but it goes to what Brendan was saying earlier, in that in the Nagel it's sort of chaos, and I think that parallels Zach most closely with Nietzsche's essay, Lies and Truth in a Non-Moral Sense, which is that when Nietzsche is making the argument that we are never actually in touch with what the world is. It's chaos. It's not something which we could articulate, and the only scary chaos. Yeah, articulate, right. The only things that we can articulate are sounds. What he would call, I guess, the stimulus that we get from observing something, and then some metaphor that we conjure up from that. And I think that leap from the stimulus we get from observing whatever is happening there to the metaphor that we create to represent it is where Brendan and Castaneda, there's a parallel between the Nagel and the tonal, and that the tonal are these things which we create to function and live among the Nagel world.
Okay. I
think, I think with Nietzsche, rationality is maddening, and Nietzsche went mad, and Hal goes mad, right, to some extent. And yes, in the novel, of course, or in the movie and the novel, there's a reason why didn't Hal go mad. Well, because he was giving conflicting instructions. That's why Hal went mad. But so are we. We've got all these conflicting ethical principles and all of these conflicting impulses and all these conflicting rights and responsibilities. And hey, that's maddening, right? So I think Nietzsche would say all of modernity is maddening. It's not. We can kind of focus on this hyper particular case. What about Hal, or what about Nietzsche, or what about whomever? But Nietzsche is really saying all of modern rationality from the Enlightenment onward, maybe from the beginnings of Western philosophy onward, is maddening in this sense.
The book I asked you about before, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Pirsig, it's written, there's several tracks.
A bestseller, if memory serves.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Speaking of the will to power, right? He found the angle.
But no one's reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and creating totalitarian society. He runs 4 tracks, at least 4 tracks.
Except the biker gangs, they're trying, right?
And one of the least ambitious things he does in that book is he explains the evolution of Western philosophy. And he contrasts Aristotle and Plato, right? And he takes it all.
Nietzsche's not fond of either one of them. Yeah.
No, neither is Pirsig for that matter. But Pirsig, okay, when he's taking all the philosophy, he's also saying, this is all, you really confuse yourself with this stuff. It's really not all that important. What's important is what's happening right in front of you right now. So, and I don't know, you guys may know what's Nietzsche's thing for what's important. If Castaneda, when he talks about the Nagel, he talks about something existing independent of us. Does Nietzsche talk about something existing independent of us?
There are certain values that Nietzsche seems to have. He certainly likes individuality and authenticity. That's clear through and through. He likes greatness. What he doesn't like is the way in which greatness gets watered down into averageness, because of for societal needs or because of culture, or because of whatever. He really does look to the individuals throughout history who achieved something great scientifically or artistically or politically or whatever. He always is looking for the strong individuals that managed to he calls them atavisms. In fact, I wrote this article, is Donald Trump an atavism of the past? These people that for one reason or another, they're just radically individualistic, radically exertive, or they're so creative that they managed to overcome the paradigm and come up with a genuinely new idea, a genuinely new way of looking at things that had never been considered before, which is a kind of metaphorical strength. It's not a physical strength, but it's a type of strength. It's a metaphorical strength. It's an intellectual strength, a creative strength. But not everyone is like that. Most people just live their lives and they deal with the world as it's been handed to them. They're not trying to change things. They're not trying to overcome things. They're not trying to exert themselves. But there are these rare individuals in history that have managed to overcome it all. The Julius Caesars or the Napoleons, who Nietzsche really liked as well. Or, now Nietzsche would have cited Isaac Newton, but we might now say, what about the Einsteins or the great figures that have moved culture or science forward in some way? Not even in some teleological directional way, just in the sense of being so radically different and outside the box, where they just were not, they refused to take reality as it was.
And I think the other thing too that's worth noting, Brendan, just to your point about what Nietzsche found meaningful independent of people, is the most succinct answer to that question might be nothing. I think it's worth arguing that Nietzsche was an existentialist at heart. And so to the extent that anybody could maybe put their finger on a definition for existentialism, it's that existence precedes essence, meaning you exist and are in this world before it has any sort of meaning. And so to the extent that anybody might look to Nietzsche for him to make an argument in pursuit of some sort of external value, they might starve themselves to death intellectually, because for Nietzsche, the ultimate measure of a meaningful life was how you expressed yourself. To seek that sort of meaning externally from you is antithetical to his corpus of work.
There's a sense in which the role that Nietzsche plays is analogous to how Socrates described himself. Socrates described himself as a gadfly stinging the people of Athens to kind of wake themselves up a bit. And I think Nietzsche is doing the same thing, except he's much less systematic about it.
But Socrates had a definite sense of morality.
That's true. Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean,
Right.
Right.
I don't. Did you have something in Nietzsche that corresponds to that in Socrates?
I think it's an interesting analogy because they go about it in such radically different ways. Like Socrates was a moralist, and so was Plato. And they thought that, so what Socrates really didn't like about the people of Athens, that he thought they knew they thought they knew it all, and really they didn't know what they were talking about. So he started walking around Athens, talking to people and asking them questions, and coming to expose the fact that they didn't really know what they were talking about. They didn't really know the definitions of the words they were using even. And no one likes to be made a fool of, so they killed him. Right? But with Nietzsche's in a slightly different situation though, because, he wants to wake people up, but he wants to wake people up to the fact that everything that makes them who they are has been defined externally. It's been decided upon them by other people. It's been forced upon them by their religion and by their culture. Their innate drives and even their ambitions, the goals that they have and the projects they take upon themselves, the skills they choose to learn, or just the ambitions they've got, or the dreams they've got, they all kind of get watered down from all these societal pressures and family pressures and cultural pressures and pressures to be moral and good and decent and political and do the right thing. And it just waters us down. So he's trying to wake people up.
It seems like Donald Trump would be a Nietzschean kind of guy.
Except for the fact that he's so cruel. I think that's the part that Nietzsche wouldn't get, because that cruelty is reactive in the same way that he finds all of Judeo-Christian morality to be reactive. It's a reactive power move that is not authentic.
Now I'm not saying, because I haven't read, but you're saying he liked Caesar?
He did, yeah, and Napoleon.
He liked Napoleon. Those guys were kind of cruel.
But what he liked was their ability to their desire and somewhat success, large success to a large degree, to shape the world the way they want it to be.
To subjugate other humans.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is a really interesting question. To be an authentic, exertive individual, do you ipso facto have to subdue others, or is there a more authentic, less destructive way of being authentic, or is it by definition subduing others? When I read Nietzsche, I don't hear that he, even though he likes the Julius Caesars and the Napoleons, I actually think of it more like what he's not doing is saying they're doing it right. He's saying they were able to overcome all of the herd-like nature around them and be exertive. And a lot of us can't even ever get there. And they were able to get there, maybe not in a very good way even, but they were able to do it. And I don't think he's looking to them as ideals. He's looking to them as examples of the principle that he has in mind, that really modern future humans will do it better and more authentically.
But he admires them for having done it.
Yes. He admires them for having tried it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think he might even admire Donald Trump for that reason, oddly enough.
Well, that's where I was going.
Mm-hmm. But in saying that, you got to be really careful. He's not saying Julius Caesar was a good guy. He's not saying Napoleon was a good guy. He's not saying Donald Trump is a good guy. What he is saying is there is some psychological fact about those individuals that allowed them to transcend the herd-like people around them. And that's praiseworthy in itself, is praiseworthy, he would say. Now, it doesn't mean they could have done it better. They could have been less cruel. They could have been more effective. They could have whatever. So he's not saying they're ideals, but he is saying that there's some praiseworthy aspect of those individuals that we should continue to look to.
They're psychopaths and narcissists.
Yeah, I don't know. Or they were,
they were what?
They were something else.
What else?
I don't know if Julius Caesar was a psychopath. That doesn't sound right.
Well, when you can kill people with impunity, that's a psychopath. When you have
I think the unfortunate thing about our modern world is we find lots of ways to kill people with impunity. We just couch it in friendlier terms.
No, I think there's a lot of psychopaths around, but I don't think we're all psychopaths, and I don't think that we all are coming from the same thing. I think some of us.
There are lots of decent people in political power that decide who lives and who dies and who suffers and who doesn't suffer, and they couch it in very, very socially acceptable terms.
I don't know. For myself, I don't think anybody has a right to determine who lives and who dies. It's.
I guess this is all of why I think this is why you get theories of morality in general, because every decision you make affects people, and a lot of those decisions are life.
Where does Nietzsche lead you if you're interested in a theory of morality?
Hey, there isn't one for him. You know, any attempt to provide a general theory of morality for him is making the mistake of again, all these mistakes in once. It forces us to be more herd-like for the sake of getting along well with each other and making a harmonious existence that we don't have to be as afraid of. It makes the mistake of mistaking our individual perspectives for the universal perspective. And so there, you know, any attempt to kind of go, what about this general theory of morality? Nietzsche's going to go, bad move. You don't get to do that. You know, you're making the same mistakes every moral philosopher in history has ever made, according to Nietzsche, the second you make that move.
When you're saying that, I think you're saying that cooperation is a negative thing.
That doesn't sound right either to me, honestly. I mean, you know,
that's how you right to me, but
that's how you get things done. You have to cooperate, right?
Yeah, see, I think you have to cooperate. So I think,
but someone still has to be in. I think Nietzsche is he's not a, you know, he's not, I don't know if he's an authoritarian, but yeah, someone has to be in charge and someone has to have the vision.
Someone like Nietzsche.
Yeah, or whoever's in charge of the group that's making the thing, right? Whatever the project is that you have to cooperate for.
Well, when you say herd-like, I think you're.
But I think this is where there might be a bit of a, for me, I see Nietzsche a bit differently in that Nietzsche was, I think, an intense critic of just a sort of blind subscription to any sort of ideology, whether that be some moral code or what have you. I don't think Nietzsche,
blind ideology would be the worst kind.
Right, but I'm not convinced that Nietzsche would criticize somebody who, upon deliberating on the principles of Judeo-Christian philosophy or Aristotelian virtue ethics or whatever it might be, I don't think Nietzsche would have a criticism for somebody who, upon reflecting on that and deliberating on that, came to the conclusion that this is how they best affirmed their life. And so in one breath, this is sort of the transition, I think, from the camel skipping over the line all the way to the child, where in the camel, you're sort of just accepting whatever, you know, the kids that grow up in the religious household and they don't, you know, eat meat on Fridays, or they go to church every Sunday, and it's like, I don't know, my parents just always told me to do this, and so I do it, and therefore it's the right thing. And it's like, well, Nietzsche would say, no, it's not.
I guess I have a slightly different take on that, because, you know, I'm picturing the person you just described, the person who deliberates and says, well, there's all these theories of morality or these different political theories or whatever. And after deliberating on it, I'm going to settle on being an Aristotelian. I'm going to settle on being a Platonist. I'm going to settle on being a Marxist. I'm going to settle on being Trumpian, whatever. I think Nietzsche, there's, how to put this? There's a reason he chose the title The Gay Science for that book, The Happy Science, because we might be totally comfortable with all the decisions we make. I've deliberated on it. I've done my research. I've made a decision, or if I'm a scientist, I found the next great discovery, whatever it is, learned lots of things, and I've settled on something. I'm in charge now because I'm rational and I've deliberated and I've made a decision. I think Nietzsche would still say, you know, but what that ignores is the fact that it still just kind of makes you feel good after having taken that much control over your life to have deliberated so much. You know, there is this subconscious need to be in control of the situation. And one way we do that is to deliberate and rationalize and make a decision. And that in itself still has this latent fear and this latent need to be comfortable and safe and secure and feel good about our decisions. And that's driving us. That's the psychological drive that's driving that cool deliberation that you just described.
And it's funny too, you mentioned rationality, and Brendan, you asked before, or you made a point before about maybe there are conflicting definitions of rationality at play here. One of the things that I found most powerful in my study of Nietzsche was reading Dostoevsky with Nietzsche, because I think to some extent Dostoevsky is the dramatist to Nietzsche's philosophy, or maybe Nietzsche is the philosopher that articulates the underpinnings of Dostoevsky's drama. And one of my favorite works of Dostoevsky is his Notes from Underground, in which he describes the bureaucrat that partakes in some just petty tyrant of his small bureaucratic power. And one of the passages that I really like from that is Dostoevsky's critique of rationality as it relates to man, when he goes, rationality fails in its analysis when it looks back at the history of man, because if you look back at the history of man, you see nothing but slaughters and genocides and starvations and all these miserable things that if any rational being were to look back, they could say, well, in what benefit was this? How did this serve?
How rational are we? Yeah,
how rationally are you? And he goes on to say, which is particularly interesting, he draws this analogy that I'm going to butcher the phrasing, but it's essentially, he goes, when you end up tabulating life around the theories of somewhat arithmetic, well, 2 × 2 makes 4, whether I have a say in it or not. And I think that maybe that is what Nietzsche is talking about when it comes to rationality, the things that necessarily flow from one or another, the principles of logic. That's the rationality, I think, that Nietzsche is critiquing, because to follow that along its path is not you to assert yourself as a human being, but simply to follow what comes necessarily next.
In terms of Dostoevsky, I believe, and I kill names now, okay, but I'm pretty sure he wrote The Idiot.
Yes.
And that was one of my all-time favorite books. And the main character is Prince Mishkin. And they ask him, in subsequent to his writing it, like, what did you do? What was this character you created? Why? And his thing was, Mishkin is a truly beautiful person. So Dostoevsky wrote a book, I think, that I read, I'm pretty sure, and his main character was his ideal of a beautiful person. And that character in the book was really focused toward problem solving and doing things that were beneficial to people. I don't.
Is there a question? Is there a question in there?
No, I'm just saying, no, you mentioned Dostoevsky and you mentioned Nietzsche.
Well, okay. I do want to get her back talking about the movie. We're kind of veered away from the movie, but with Dostoevsky, one of his, well-known quotes is that, or maybe it's Voltaire. Oh God, I'm embarrassed now. He says, if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. And that's the starting point. I think that sums up Nietzsche in a nutshell too. If God doesn't exist, if there's no external definer of morality or human nature, then really we have this blank human canvas in front of it. And I think this is one of the Nietzschean things that comes into play at the end of the movie with the space baby. We have this kind of blank human future in front of us. Yeah, we have how we've been in the past. Yeah, we've got these herd-like individuals over here and these more powerful individuals over here, and all this violence over here and all these great achievements over here. But the future is still kind of a blank canvas. We don't have anything that ties us down that says how we have to be in the future. The mistake that we've made is treating some of these aspects of humanity that were not, didn't always exist and have an evolutionary history, like rationality, like our culture, like our morality, like, all the things we've been talking about that Nietzsche is criticizing. What we've done culturally that's a mistake, he thinks, is making them the defining characteristics of humanity, like man as a rational animal, like Aristotle did. Man is a rational animal. That's how Aristotle defined humanity, right? To some extent. Except Plato called us a featherless biped, but Aristotle said we were rational animals. But if you second you say, well, that's the defining characteristic of humanity, to the exclusion of all these other components of humanity, to the exclusion of this evolutionary history that brought it into being in the first place, to the exclusion of all the future possibilities yet to be explored. You've made a mistake, because those qualities are not essential to humankind anymore. They're inconsequential, like Nietzsche says in that piece I sent. We have rationality, yeah, but it's this evolutionary quirk. It's a quirk of the universe. It's not the defining characteristic of anything. And what we've done is mistaken that really tangential, inconsequential, maybe cosmically unimportant aspect of ourselves that we kind of ignore the dark underbelly of all the time for the sake of putting it on a pedestal, and made that our defining characteristic. But at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, you've got the space baby, right? We've somehow, so we view ourselves as being the pinnacle of creation. You know, we're a modern man, we're rational, we're evolved, we're enlightened, we're fill in the blank. Like this, the whole story of Western culture and the whole story of Western enlightenment and the whole story of modern man wrapped into a little ball there. You know, Nietzsche is saying that's not an end in itself. That's not the end point. That's not the telos. That's not the goal. That in itself is something to be transcended. How to do it? Who knows? I don't think Nietzsche himself even knows. I think he just knows it has to happen. So, you know, the space baby is a very Nietzschean concept. This notion that, you know, humanity is not done evolving. Rationality is not the end goal. It's not the defining characteristic. Our Western culture is not the defining characteristic. It's not the goal. We're not all of those things are things to be overcome and things to be transcended by people who become Ubermensches and people who can be what he calls future philosophers, the people who aren't bound by rationality and bound by morality and bound by culture.
The space baby has simply been exposed to a larger reality. So the space baby, using term rationality, can't just factor out all this experience that they had when they were on Jupiter, right? Now there's a larger cosmos and there's more to be incorporated. Jumping back to something else you said, one of my favorite things, it may have been Zero Mostel line in a movie, was the reward for a virtuous life is a virtuous life. And I'm thinking Nietzsche would probably think you were simple-minded if you took that perspective.
Well, I actually think he would say two conflicting things about that. One, he would say he would praise that sentiment for its lack of escapism. Like what he really doesn't like is like, I'll be rewarded in some, you know, abstract afterlife, religious or otherwise. He doesn't like that at all. I think he would like the emphasis on just being present and that being reward in itself. But I think he still wouldn't like the averaging quality. Like, you know, most of what we think of as morality for Nietzsche is really more positive way to couch this pressure to be average instead of becoming great. So, and we couch that in language of morality, but really it's to subdue people.
I don't know. I mean, I've met a lot of people. I've worked with a lot of people. I don't take things as a given. Okay, so I don't take it as a given, for instance, that people want to be great.
Oh, most people don't. I think that's part of the problem, Nietzsche says. You know, they've become so comfortable with being average, they don't even know how to want to be great.
I don't know that average is a meaningful concept. If you look at five people,
yeah, but that is like you know, what are the origins of Western morality? Like, you know, it's Aristotle's notion of being virtuous by constraining yourselves and avoiding the vices of life.
One of my critiques of Aristotle is that he doesn't seem to care much about reality, right? He posits perfect things, perfect circles, what have you.
You might be thinking of Plato there.
No, I'm thinking of Aristotle as opposed to Plato. Plato's more down to earth, gritty. Aristotle is more into abstract.
Quite the
things.
opposite, actually. Yeah.
Really? Do I have them reversed?
You have them backwards. Yeah.
I think it was Plato's world of the forms that he posited that things in our world participated in this perfect world.
One of those boys.
Well, Nietzsche would lump them all together. They're all averaging. None of them is great
Right.
for the human spirit, Nietzsche
But
thinks. So
when you're looking at things in such an abstract way, you're not focused on what's in front of you. I don't know what a perfect circle is. I know what appears to be a circle, or what I'll call a circle for ease, for shorthand. You can get lost in that kind of stuff. I think philosophers often do. I find philosophers, let me withdraw that. Back to Nietzsche for a second. I almost see Nietzsche as someone who was just decomposing as he's getting older.
There's some evidence for that. I mean, his dad died of what they called a softening of the brain too, and there was a question as to whether or not that was a form of syphilis or some genetic, some genetic defect that he had. And certainly Nietzsche, at the end of his life, became capacitated and died of syphilis. So there might be some merit to that in his later work.
But I'm just, his thought process, it's so restrictive. You know, you're talking about him as wanting to throw out everything and just experience it for yourself. But man, this guy comes up with such, at least the short 8 pages I read, was such rigid constructs.
I find it the exact opposite. I find from in so many of Nietzsche's books, he jumps from topic to topic to topic to topic. He explores aspects of humanity or aspects of culture that other philosophers hadn't been willing to discuss or find interesting. And I think he's one of the freest philosophers out there. He tap dances from concept to concept to concept, from view to view to view, in ways that other philosophers have boxed themselves in on. So I think of his works more like intellectual play more than anything.
It's called loosening of associations. In another
except
world.
he does have these scathing criticisms of culture and religion, alongside all of it. But
I just, back to 2001. 2001, the movie, I think, was co-opted by Kubrick, or the book was co-opted by Kubrick. I don't know the clock.
I think the book was written at the same time as the movie. Like they were working on the movie, and Clark, they had the short story, The Sentinel, but I think the book and the movie were kind of co-created.
You think Kubrick had a say in the creation of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the book?
I think they were produced at the same time. I don't think the book predated the movie.
Well, I don't know. I think
I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm almost certain that they were working on the movie, and while they were working on the movie, Clark was writing the book.
Huh. Well,
might fact check me on that, but
okay. Fact check me. I don't think that's the case, but I could be very wrong.
The Sentinel was it came out in the late 40s. That short story had been around for a long time, so the seed of the idea was around. But we could Google it. It's the 21st century. We could look it up. You use this technology that Kubrick or Nietzsche are criticizing, and
why do that when we can just create our own reality, when we can use our own creative instincts or abilities to create philosophies and what have you that thrill us?
So I think you're right, though. It's no Kubrick definitely squeezed Nietzsche into the movie, but what follows from that? Like, so what?
Well, I think most people are familiar with 2001 by virtue of seeing the movie. I saw the movie when it first came out, so God, it's over half a century ago. I did not get anything from the movie. I didn't even know what the hell was going on, right? Reading the book, I came to understand what was being said. Being exposed to Nikki's comment and then your essay. First time anybody ever put an overlay of Nietzsche on any of this for me. I don't know, and maybe I'm just not versed enough in Nietzsche. I don't know that there's any correlation between 2001 and Nietzsche. I think 2001 is talking about evolution of man and the consequences of being exposed to an alien culture. So, straight science fiction.
Except that doesn't account for sort of the metaphorical richness of the end of the movie. If that's all there is to the movie.
But at the end of the movie, I think it's a simple statement being made. The world is bigger than we know. Our experience has been limited to this globe. And the minute we step off of this globe, our minds are going to have to take in a new reality. That's, I think, as simple as I think that's what's being
Yeah,
said.
to me, that just sounds like Nietzsche with a science fiction twist.
Oh my God.
Because like Nietzsche is saying, we humans, we tend to look at the whole universe through our own little tiny keyholes. And now we're looking at it from a cosmic perspective, just as Nietzsche does in the beginning of that article that I sent you. He's saying,
Well,
with, there are aspects of humanity that we thought were ideals that actually are kind of destructive, the stuff that he goes into in maybe in the sequel 2010, but the stuff that's explored in the beginning of the movie are warlike natures. Regardless of the evolutionary history, at least the apes at the beginning of the movie are a metaphor for humans, right? We are warlike. And all of that is stuff that can be transcended. So just this, it sounds so simple, but this notion of transcendence, like, yes, we have humanity as we've been, culture as it's been, politics as it's been, art as it's been, every aspect of rationality as it's been, morality or virtue as it's been. What we can't do is take that as fixed and given and necessary. What we do need to do is look beyond it and say, what's the next step in human evolution, culturally or biologically, even any of
I
the
don't
above.
know if it's a question of taking it as fixed and necessary.
But we
As
do.
much
If you're a
as-
Platonist, you go, hey, 2 + 2 = 4, and there's something
but-
necessary about that,
But you can't just discount it either. There are things that happen, at least, I mean, I don't know what happened when I wasn't around but I don't know what's happening in the next room in the house yet. But I'm going to assume, take on good faith that something is happening. And when certain things are described, I'm willing to accept some of the accounts that people share with me of what they experienced. I can't negate all that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't just ignore it or pretend it doesn't have consequences. I guess there's been people are getting crazy about our withdrawal from Afghanistan. I don't know how they thought we could withdraw from Afghanistan where it wouldn't descend into exactly what it's descended into. There was no way to leave Afghanistan and not have what's happening. But people are getting cuckoo about that. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because it's easy to take Nietzsche in a political direction. We talked about this at the beginning of the discussion, but Nietzsche at the same time says, let small minds think about small problems and let big minds think about big problems. So the political realm, I think Nietzsche thinks of as largely a realm for small minds.
Big problems for Nietzsche is Nietzsche's desire. Big problems are the things that bring him joy. And maybe I'm
I think that's right. I think that's right. I do. I think that's why he chose the name The Gay Science for that book. And I think that's why he has these inspiring titles for his other books, like Dawn of Day or Daybreak, depending on how you translate it. Like that's an inspiring concept, a new dawn for humanity. In fact, this is a very Nietzschean concept right from the movie, right? How does the movie start? It's a new dawn. Look at the sunrise above the monolith right behind me in the picture here. One of Nietzsche's books is named The Dawn of Day or Daybreak. This is a new dawn. And at the end of the movie, what do you get? Another new dawn for humanity.
Okay. But there's
a big cosmic do-over. Time to what's happening tomorrow?
There's a lot of value judgments being made there. At least the way you're presenting it, assuming you have an accurate.
Oh yeah, I mean Nietzsche's not neutral. I mean Nietzsche's. I mean, but what he's not doing is mistake. What he would not say is he's not trying to give you a theory of morality or a theory of politics. He's going to say, here's my critique of the people I don't like, or the cultural things I don't like, or the religions I don't like, or the philosophical things I don't like. And that's my take on it. I'm writing Nietzsche. And I think this is an important part of understanding Nietzsche. One of his values is that you need to be writing your own life as if it were a story. You need to be the author of your own life. So, and all this stuff that Nietzsche is, you could mistake Nietzsche as saying it objectively. I really think of it more like literature, where he's writing Nietzsche, the character, in the same way that Hemingway kind of writes himself as a character, maybe.
I think you probably have an accurate understanding of what Nietzsche is saying.
I think I take it in a more artistic direction than a lot of folks do.
But I think that may be what he's saying. But the relevance for us may be negative. It may lead to bad things if you start thinking in those terms.
You know,
You end up-
but you know, again, taking the 21st century perspective on this, the post 20th century era, look at all the terrible things that happened in the 20th century because of human rationality, so-called rationality, right?
I don't know. See, when you're going with, let me throw something at you. My uncle was a deputy in the Italian parliament. He, as a child, was a friend of Benito Mussolini. My father was the baby of the family, so he knew him too. Okay. Mussolini came in, my uncle and another group of deputies opposed him, and they were all locked up. My father was a sea captain and was smuggling people out of Italy that was wanted by the fascists.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a sense, I guess, instilled in me or presented to me, and I've accepted it and incorporated it into my sense of things, of responsibility that we have to people at large, a greater responsibility than just that to ourselves. Or if there is a responsibility we have to ourselves, it should be predicated on the belief that we are no more valuable than anybody else on the planet.
Yeah, and I think this is where, you know, I mean, Nietzsche probably has his weaknesses as an existentialist. I think, you know, someone like Kierkegaard may have slightly more to say on that kind of thing. Like, you know, Kierkegaard would say, you know, you can be moral, you can act a certain way because it's the right thing to do, you know, because you've been told it, or even because you're a Kantian and you've thought about it, just because it's the right thing to do out of mere duty, right? But then there's a way of doing the right thing authentically because it's meaningful to you in some way. And that's more authentic and it's better in some way, is basically what Kierkegaard has to say about that. So it's the same action. It doesn't boil down to the action. It boils down to, is it an authentic thing for you? And Nick, you were kind of alluding to this, that you can do the very same action, you know, out of duty or out of necessity or out of pressure, or you can do that action authentically because it's meaningful to you. And from an existentialist standpoint, that's usually the better way to go. So you know, what you're essentially saying is it's not just about duty, it's that it's meaningful to you to think of it that way.
Nick, I'm just curious, you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, at least as the way that I read Nietzsche, I mean, I think
Forget Nietzsche for a minute. I'm just curious personally. I'm thinking Nietzsche should be like a pack of cigarettes now, his books, with a warning, this can be dangerous to your health. In terms of whether or not it's sufficient just to be content within yourself with what it is you're coming up with. Is there a larger responsibility you have?
Sure. Yeah, I think to the extent that you're living inauthentically, you're not doing yourself any favors, and you're not doing your fellow man any favor.
What's inauthentic? You guys using words. What's inauthentic? I don't understand that.
Yeah, I think it's unique to each person. I think that's what Nietzsche is saying.
But he's saying if you're living authentically in his concept of it, that's fine.
You're
That's
doing
what
okay.
It is interesting to, you know, I mean, I think different existentialist philosophers probably have different views of what authenticity means. You know, for someone like Heidegger, it's more like being immersed in projects that you care about. You know, for someone like Kierkegaard, it's more like, you know, making a leap of faith versus doing something out of duty, you know, something really so meaningful that you're even willing to be irrational to take that irrational leap of faith, you know, and that's how he views religion. For Nietzsche, I think it's a little more, you have to be different in some key way for Nietzsche. He's an individualist. Like if you start being too much like other people, having the same worldview as other people, having the same morality as other people, having the same artistic creations as other people, fitting in with the herd just a little too much, you know, that's, you know, Nietzsche just wants you to be stronger than that and be different in some key way. All of those are authenticity, aren't they? I don't know.
What's the value? I'm just curious. What's the value of studying Nietzsche?
I think it exposes the many ways in which the things that you think of as essential to yourself are actually not very essential and have been imposed on you from outside.
Like what?
Morality and culture.
I'm playing devil's advocate for a moment. So,
and maybe rationality too, but at least morality and culture.
I guess where I'm going, and it could apply to any philosopher, is it's almost like we're studying philosophers, we're becoming dilettantes. You know, it's like for the sake of what? Studying Nietzsche for the sake of studying Nietzsche? What does he give us that contributes to the good? But I guess I'm asking what contributes to the good, and maybe someone who's into Nietzsche would say there is no such thing as the good. The good is whatever you decide is
Well,
good.
you know, again, you know, what does the good mean? The common good, the communal good, the public good, you know, all of those are kind of herd-like concepts for Nietzsche. So when you
Okay.
say the good, immediately there's so much that Nietzsche
Okay.
would criticize packed into that very notion, I think.
Okay, so let me give you a good, okay? A good is not rounding up people because of their religion, sending them to a concentration camp and killing them.
That I think Nietzsche would actually, I think Nietzsche would very much agree with that.
But okay, but you asked, what is the good? I'm giving you a good.
Well, I mean,
He might
Brendan,
disagree about why that's not good.
one of the things that I have the advantage of is that I've come to know you, Brendan, and I know that, for instance, you were a therapist. One of the many things you were was a therapist, and I know that you would work with people in therapy. And so I'd be interested to know, in your professional opinion, at least, what was your aim of therapy when working with individuals? I get that it could be a bit general and that people's needs might diverge depending on the client. I mean, but could you say that there was a general articulable principle in helping somebody in therapy?
The only thing my answer to that is that if I was helping people, I was helping them to understand what it was, or to articulate what it was they wanted, and then to evaluate whether or not they were going about getting it in a way that they were apt to get it. And I guess hand in hand with that is whether or not what they wanted was good for them in terms of their life. You know, if someone wanted to be able to drink a bottle of cyanide, I would say, hey, you can do it, but you know,
it's interesting because, you know, what you're at least the first like 2/3 of what you described sounds very Nietzschean in quality. You know, learning enough about yourself to know what you want, or even what's good for you necessarily based on the kind of person you are. Seeing all the artificial constraints or the internal constraints that keep you from being that way. That's all the stuff that Nietzsche wants to uncover. He wants you to be more autonomous in that way, just like I think it's exactly like you described, except for this very almost essentialist notion of that there's some objective good for humanity or for people in general, that, you know, some things are inherently good and some things aren't inherently good. But the first 2/3 of what you said sounded a lot like Nietzsche to me.
I think when you get to talking about good and bad or good and evil, you know, that's a personal decision you come to. Okay, what is moral, and how do I go about living a moral life if I'm concerned about living a moral life? I'm not sure that from what you all have been describing about Nietzsche, that he really cared, or that if people took him to heart, we would have a more civil or less violent.
I don't know if I don't think he'd want it to be more violent, but I don't think he'd want it to be civil in the sense of, you know, we all water ourselves down for the sake of playing nice with each other in the forum. Right?
I don't do that. You don't know me, Nick.
But I don't think he means that society. So I don't think he wants civil in any kind of, like, you know,
But I think
ultra civilized, like a modern man. You know, you're very, you don't exert yourself. You're very cool. You're deliberate. You're rational. You're not moved by things emotionally very much. But you're civil and public and political and all the things we associate with, like, the ideal 20th century politician or the 19th century politician.
But I think what Nietzsche does want, Brendan, just to parallel that with what you were saying, is for a person to understand what it is that they want and to launch themselves towards that. You know, to the extent that it becomes destructive, I think is where maybe Nietzsche falls apart a little bit and is maybe one of his shortcomings, because, I mean, Zach, you might be able to speak more of this than I can, but I'm not sure Nietzsche offers anything in terms of, well, you know, find who you are and launch yourself upon that, unless it is to, you know, be dishonest or to cheat and steal from your neighbor or to covet thy neighbor's wife. Like he doesn't offer any of these sort of affirmative
Well,
moral.
what I do want to say about that is the things that sound really praiseworthy have this kind of negative undercurrent for Nietzsche. The people that are really civil and really moral and really whatever, there's this kind of dark underbelly to the psychology behind that Nietzsche wants to lay bare. At the same time, the things that sound really negative, the Julius Caesars and the Napoleons, there's an element of praiseworthy behavior there that he also wants to expose. So I'm not sure if Nietzsche is very prescriptive, and maybe this is where he fails. He's not very prescriptive, but he does want to say, you know, the things we take for granted as good and moral and right and civilized have this kind of dark undercurrent to them. And some of the things we dismiss a bit too easily because there are genuinely praiseworthy qualities that we think we've evolved beyond, but still really exist latently inside of us, just like the warlike nature of those apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey resurges in 2010 when the United States and Russia are about to go to war with each other. There's this latent stuff inside of us, good and bad, you know, whether you talk about ostensibly, you know, praiseworthy individuals or ostensibly, you know, terrible individuals. You know, there's an element of the positive and the negative in each one of them.
The warlike nature of apes, I'm not sure actually exists when you look at ape populations. I don't know. I haven't studied it, but I don't think the large apes.
Well, the thing is, the early modern political philosophers, from John Locke to Rousseau to Thomas Hobbes, they all had a hypothetical account of man's natural state. Like they would say, man in his natural state is like this, therefore we have to have a certain political philosophy to honor the kind of beings that we are.
You know what a lemma is in mathematics?
It's been a long time.
Okay. Well, I remember a math class in college, and professor threw up this problem on the board, and we were going crazy trying to solve it. And I said, can't solve it. And he said, oh, you can. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, use a lemma. I said, it was like Abbott and Costello playing craps on the train in Buck Privates, you know, here's the rules, but oh, there's this rule, right? When you throw this,
I want to be in the Abbott and Costello math class.
Right? So and I was like, what's a lemma? And a lemma was a definition you could insert inside of your equation that would allow you to complete the equation. But you can only complete the equation if you accepted the lemma.
And I would say early modern philosophy is like that, where political philosophers would say, here's man's natural state. That's their assumption. And then they would reason from there. Yeah, sure.
Right. I don't have any, for me personally, I don't have any of that. I don't
think Nietzsche thinks it matters, honestly. I think he would just say, you know, we have this evolutionary history. It is what it is. We know some things about it. We don't know some things about it. Certainly our rationality didn't always exist because the universe had a beginning. So it evolved in some way. And who cares, because we're a bunch of individuals, you know.
Maybe I'm more pragmatic. So I take someone like Nietzsche and I take someone like Gandhi, take someone like Martin Luther King, take someone like Ayn Rand. And I look at those are four people out there. And I think I got nothing I can criticize Gandhi and King for in terms of what they're saying to us. But on Rand and on Nietzsche, I'm left with, what are you giving us here? You know, you're giving us a lot of this and this and this.
I think Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche would say it's, how to put this? I'm trying to put it down to one word, and maybe it's an inadequate word here, but I think Nietzsche is trying to provide some inspiration. He wants to show a way to be different.
I think the other thing you might take away from Nietzsche too, that we see play out in 2001: A Space Odyssey, is that reliance on intellectualism on its own will fail you, will not serve you well.
Might even drive you mad, like it drove Hal mad. You know? Right,
exactly, and it might justify you killing a lot of people that you hold near and dear. And so I mean, Brendan, I know we've had conversations where, like, I've talked with you about some philosophy, and you're like, who cares about counting angels? How many angels could stand on the pin of a head? It's like, I think maybe that's one of Nietzsche's takeaways too, and one of the takeaways we see in 2001 is that the increasing reliance that we have on, I mean, technology, you could say in one sense, or just intelligence, intellectual rationale, is a problem and will not serve you well.
And I think technology in the movie is a metaphor for that larger sense of rationality there that Nietzsche's trying to criticize. Sure.
You mentioned Hal going crazy, and that's a misconception, right? Because Hal is a machine, electronic machine, and can't go crazy.
Well,
Hal,
it bothers me the way they
can-
watered that down in 2010 when they say, oh, they just explained it away. Well, yeah, these conflicting instructions. It was much more interesting before Arthur C. Clarke wrote that, and Hal just kind of went a little crazy.
But that wasn't Hal. Whether he was more interesting or not is not the issue. Hal was a machine, and he had conflicting instructions, conflicting code, right? I used to code. So, you know,
we all do, don't we?
No, but we're all not machines.
Yeah, but think of all the conflicts we have in our life: work life versus home life, being moral versus being creative, being political versus being, being natural. All these conflicting moral theories that we were all talking about a little bit ago. We're pulled in so many different directions, way more than Hal is.
Yes, but Hal can't go crazy. Hal is not capable of being crazy. All Hal is capable of doing is following the code.
Well, they do explore that inside the movie. They ask, do you think he really thinks? Do you think he really feels? Whatever. I forget the language they use in the movie, but they consider that, like, do you think he really is intelligent? Is he really sentient, or is he just merely following instructions?
Well, whatever they want to.
Interesting question. I'm not sure it's related to Nietzsche, but it's an interesting question.
I'm just pointing out in terms of when you talk about Hal going crazy. I just want to put that aside, or at least tag it. I don't think Hal goes crazy. Hal is just programmed with conflicting code, and when you do that, you get crazy outcomes. We've programmed.
He's no more or less crazy than the Nazis who could justify genocide, right?
How?
Sure. Yeah, he justifies murder in the name of his instructions.
No,
and that's why.
But Hal is a machine. Hal isn't justifying anything. Hal is just following code.
Yeah, I'm kind of inclined to agree with you here, Brendan, in that I don't think Hal goes crazy. I think what you see at the end when Hal starts killing everybody is the critique that Nietzsche has when he says, God is dead and we have killed him, which is that Hal does not operate on any sort of moral code. He's just following, sorry, Rosie is just going crazy. Hal is just operating on whatever code he has. He's operating to complete the objective to some extent, which is just to get to, I guess it was Jupiter in the movie. And so I don't think Hal goes crazy. I think he's doing what he was programmed to do.
Yeah, you hit on something there, Nick.
Referring to Hal as he. Now, if we changed Hal's voice in the movie, we'd be referring to Hal as she.
Which was Kubrick's original intention. Yeah, actually. Yeah, I think you hit on something though, Nick. What you see in Hal, I think, is like rationality run amok with no moral compass to guide it. And that's the kind of nihilistic situation that Nietzsche thinks all of Western culture is really in. We're heavy on the rationality. We don't really believe the God story anymore. We have these vestiges of it. So we're these hyper rational beings with no principles to guide us, nothing to appeal to. So we are analogous to Hal in that sense. It's the God is dead. There is no God in the moral sense for Hal, just like there isn't for us these days either.
Does Nietzsche ignore facts?
I don't know. What facts do you have in mind? I have no idea.
Well, things happen, and they don't just happen. Sometimes I guess they could, but I think things happen as a result of interactions. So I think there's a history or a herstory to anything that we're looking at or experiencing. And I think if you're going to understand that, you really need to delve into that and find out what it is. I don't think you can philosophize on why this happened this way or it happened that way. I think you need to be like almost a reporter. You need to be investigating, right? You need to be looking at it, and then maybe you can draw some conclusions after you've done that. But
that sounds like Wittgenstein to me. Like, stop talking so abstractly. Just let's pay attention to the actual issue and the actual facts and whatever. Yeah, I could hear the Wittgenstein influence in your the way you're framing that.
Sorokin was a sociologist. He wrote Fads and, among other things, Fads and Foibles in Modern Sociological Research, which, you know, every sociologist on the planet was throwing darts at him because he was saying, we're also just immersed in ourselves. We've, you know, we've taken theory to a level where reality is irrelevant.
Yeah, I guess Nietzsche would say we've done the same thing, but with rationality and religion. Like we've emphasized religion so much, our actual lives have become irrelevant, and we've emphasized morality so much that our actual needs have been irrelevant.
After 2001, I'm sorry, after 2001, after 9/11, oh God, I spent a year doing research. I was curious, so I read several different versions of the Bible. Then I read the Quran. And then I went out and interviewed rabbis and priests and ministers and imams. And then I read some history of the Arab people or of the Middle East. I just wanted to get oriented to what was going on. I came away from that, among other things, thinking, first of all, I don't even know what Christianity is, okay? Because Christ, for instance, assuming Christ existed and assuming that there's some modicum of accuracy in the accounts, the Gospels, Christ was a Jew. Christ didn't start a new religion. There were few things in the Bible that are directly attributable to Christ, and one of them is, he says, I didn't come here to undo the Old Testament. I mean, he makes it real clear. So when we're talking about Christianity, we're talking about something, some sect, some group, some cult that some group of people got together and created, and a lot of people have bought into. I don't know that it has anything to do with Christ.
Well, this is Nietzsche now, because Nietzsche would basically say, at least, and Nietzsche's not a fan of any Judeo-Christian morality. So if that's going to offend anyone, too bad. That's what Nietzsche says. But Nietzsche would basically say, at least the Jews had going for them that they had this enough exertiveness to invent morality, and that was their way of exerting themselves. And what he would say about Christianity is that later Christians just kind of even watered that impulse out of us for the sake of being harmonious. So Nietzsche has nothing positive to say about Christian morality, but he has this seed of praiseworthiness for Jewish morality and its exertiveness. But
when we talk about Christianity, for example, we're talking about some abstract concept and we're accepting it as real. I don't know that there is such a thing as Christianity. I know from talking to a lot of people who say they're Christian that they don't agree with a lot of stuff. There are Christians willing to kill each other over what Christianity is. And one of the few things I got directly from Christ, according to the Gospels, is you want to get to heaven, love each other. You know.
Well, one of the things you said a few minutes ago stood out to me, because you basically said, what I did, I wanted to start talking to people. So I talked to some Christians, I talked to some Muslims, I talked to whomever, all the people you listed. And this is partly the Wittgenstein in your thinking. Like, what do you do in the absence of any general principle? If there's no general morality or general theory of human nature, then all of these questions, what's right or wrong, what's the nature of reality, what's the nature of human nature, all of those questions become more like cultural anthropology, where all you can do in the absence of any general answer is just talk to this group and talk to that group and talk to this group and talk to that group and see what the field of possible answers might be, with no kind of God's eye perspective to adjudicate between them.
But I wasn't looking for what morality was. I was trying to understand why different groups of people couldn't get along. And I was going to their source, right? Their source code, the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, Quran. And I was trying to see if there's anything in there that precludes people from getting along. And then when I was talking to people who were clerics, right? I wanted to see, because they're the experts within that field, I wanted to see if there was anything they had to offer that precluded people being able to get along. That was my thing. So I wasn't looking for a definition of morality. or anything like that. I wasn't looking to understand things in that context. All I was trying to understand is what is so hard, what precludes people from just working together or at least tolerating each other.
And I think Nietzsche's answer to that is because we all still, no matter how civilized we think we've become after 2.5 million years of evolution, like we see in 2001: A Space Odyssey, we still have this latent need to exert ourselves and to be just a little better than the person next to us.
But there's a lot of people,
So we
there
can't get
are a
along.
lot of people who have no need for that at all. I think what we hear is a small percentage of people who are very loud and get a lot of attention. I don't know that they're representative of our species.
Yeah, I guess the thing that Nietzsche would say that's different from that, though, is Nietzsche would say that there might be people that don't act that way or think they're that way, but really that same drive is there. It's just exerting itself in different ways. They're becoming a little more civilized, a little more moral, a little more something than other folks.
Everything is by definition then. There's nothing experiential with him.
No, I think he's just saying that even the most praiseworthy person you could identify, they are exerting themselves even in their praiseworthiness.
That's by his definition. There's nothing other than his statement to validate that. Validate is the wrong word to use here, but there's nothing in there to support that. He's got an opinion, which gets me back to where I think when I read his works, it reminded me of schizophrenics I work with in mental institutions, that there's something lacking there.
I guess I don't understand that perspective, because I mean, sometimes Nietzsche's all over the place, but sometimes he has these massively insightful insights into how's that for eloquent after 2.5 hours? He has these insights into the kind of latent psychology behind things that either look good or look like they're doing just fine, but he's managed to expose something deep in there that is really there that we don't like to pay attention to because it makes us uncomfortable.
I think you can be frightened to the point where you create your own reality. And
Nietzsche said that's what we've done in our modern world. We're so frightened we created the modern world.
And I think he's done it in spades. I think he's in claiming whatever he's claiming about why you shouldn't do this. He's creating one. He's creating a really elaborate one.
I know. I'm sorry, an elaborate what?
An elaborate reality for himself. I guess to me that sounds like a criticism, but I think Nietzsche would view that as a positive. Of course, Nietzsche would say all he's doing is creating his reality as he sees it and no one else. Which is a definition of, I think, potential definition for schizophrenia.
And I guess in response, Nietzsche would say that's all any of us ever does. If you think you're not doing that, you're deluding yourself because you've mistaken your subjective window into reality for the objective measure of reality.
In the end of his life, for a decent portion of it, he ended up having to rely on others for survival. And so that's where his philosophy took him. And other people who don't go in that direction, up until the day they're dying, they're contributing something in some way. They're not just relying totally on other people for their existence.
It's hard to know what's what there. I mean, it's hard to separate the, illness from the psychology, from the art, from the philosophy, from the, I don't know how to peel back those layers and figure out what was really going on with Nietzsche in particular. But
what's interesting, I found myself in the last couple of days, the more I explored Nietzsche, the more Ayn Rand was popping into my head, who I thought was a psychotic as well. And I thought she became like a celebrity. I think Nietzsche became a celebrity, and they were treated
posthumously, maybe, but yeah.
But they were treated as celebrities.
But Nietzsche himself said, he was writing for future thinkers, not not for his contemporaries.
But those who study them, those who find value in them, they kind of ignore the fact that both of these people have been taken up by lots of other people and done terrible, those other people have done terrible things as a result. I think,
I don't know, but you can say that about anything. Oh, look at what those nuclear engineers have done with mathematics. You know, they made nuclear bombs. You can say that about anything. So
I can't say that about Martin Luther King Jr. I don't have, I can't say
it's as a question for a completely different day, because I think we're running out of steam and time here.
Okay.
But it would be interesting to say, take someone as praiseworthy as Martin Luther King. What would Nietzsche expose psychologically going on in Martin Luther King that it would be interesting to have a Nietzschean analysis of Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know what that would look like, but I would love to think about it.
Let me know.
I would have to think more about it because I don't know enough about it probably. But
well, let me
it is an interesting notion, because that's what Nietzsche does though. Nietzsche says, oh, we think this morality is so praiseworthy, but look at all these psychological drives that are driving it. Oh, we think these people who are so civilized are so praiseworthy, but oh, look how weak they are. And he's constantly taking what looks like a positive and kind of just exposing the latent stuff behind it. He absolutely is making a value judgment. Of course he is.
He's
not
saying
neutral.
Someone is weak. Maybe that's my ultimate critique. You use the word weak. He looks at it and says this person's weak.
Yeah.
They're weak because they care about other people?
No, I would say they're weak because if Nietzsche is going to call anybody weak, he would call them weak because they center themselves. The way that they choose to manifest themselves in the world is through some pre-established belief system, which they subscribe to blindly. I think that's
to be for the sake of being part of the herd for Nietzsche.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
As opposed to Nietzsche, right? Who he's in his, what I would call grandiosity, he's describing himself as what? Or he's describing a model here for...
In fairness, Nietzsche was a pretty grandiose, arrogant person. I think he's quoted as saying, I can write in one sentence when some people write in one book, and even then I could write more than that. So I think Nietzsche thought pretty highly of himself. In fairness.
But again, but that's intentional, because it's also intentional as a, whether it was true or not, who knows? I wasn't Nietzsche, we weren't there, right? But what it, in terms of how he's describing himself, that's very intentional as a way of distinguishing himself from people that they want to be meek, they want to be humble, so he's going 180 degrees the other direction. He's being arrogant on purpose.
Only I can solve the problems facing the United States today. Donald Trump. Nietzsche, I don't see a lot to distinguish Nietzsche from someone like that. I don't see.
Yeah, again, I just think it's a mistake to think of Nietzsche as interpreting Nietzsche's reference to power as that kind of brute force political cruelty. That's not what Nietzsche meant. I think Nietzsche himself would say that in itself is a sign of the nihilism that we have culturally that we need to transcend. So I don't think that's a very good analogy. But
well, I think I'm sitting here with two Nietzsche guys. You guys are sitting.
I never planned to be a Nietzsche philosopher, but I seem to have become one. So
So whoever is watching this, if anybody ever watches this, there's there's some room for debate as to what Nietzsche is about, even as to what 2001 is about. I think everything we're talking about applies to what's happening today, whether we're looking at 2001 or reading the book or what have you. I think there are things in that you can take away and apply to what's happening today and derive
I think one thing Nietzsche really doesn't respect is any kind of resentment, any kind of any time in which you have some latent resentment that's built up and you react accordingly. And sometimes that's manifested itself in morality, like it did, he thinks, for Judeo-Christian morality. Sometimes he thinks it manifests itself in terms of our need for rationality and consistency to make ourselves feel a little safer in the world. And I think now we have this I don't know, almost like omnipresent political resentment. Each side resents each other. Each side's got its laundry list of, wrongs and hatreds and things they've got resentment for. And so it's manifesting itself in this really exertive way, but it's all based in this resentment that Nietzsche really does not find praiseworthy.
I don't agree with that at all. I spent the last 4 years prior to this year reading everything I could. I read some 30 books, didn't read any novels. I was reading a lot of books that deal with politics or are written by people who are in positions of authority, whether elected or appointed, in an attempt to try to understand what's happening now. And what's happening now, I think, is happening very much by design. I don't, way too big a topic, but I think we've been subjected to a massive propaganda campaign going back to the end of World War II, coming forward. And I think all we're seeing is a result of that. You're an educator. Okay, I was teaching. You have a lot of authority as an educator. You have a lot of ability to influence minds. And and if you allow yourself to be co-opted, right, you can do a lot of damage. One of the things
I agree with all that. I just think we've all been co-opted in ways we haven't realized. I think that's what Nietzsche is trying to expose,
In Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, one of the Piasek's thing is, as you go up through the educational pyramid, right, you get closer and closer to the top, you're given degrees that result in you having more authority or more power. And his thesis is that on the route up, there's a conscious effort to weed out anybody who's going to use it in any way other than the way they want you to use it.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think people were in a position, this is again a Nietzschean analysis, but there's a desire to have members of the herd in the herd. So if you're going to be too different, you're excluded. And people in power want people who are going to be herd-like.
Well,
so
I don't think that accounts for it all. I think there's some things by design. Somebody sat down and thought about structuring the, I don't know, you guys, when I was coming up, right, we had the Vietnam War, the draft was a big deal. General Hershey controlled the selective service system. And one of the two fascinating things about it is when we were embroiled in the controversy of how to make the draft fast. One thing I learned is we didn't always have a draft. So here we are talking about how do you make it fair, and no one's saying, do we need it at all? The second thing was hearing General Hershey talk, which I did. And he explained how he structured society, if you will, by the draft and the criteria for the draft. When I was working up in New England, and for a while I was teaching, and I had a superintendent explain to me how I just didn't understand what was really going on. That the idea here is for a kid to graduate, and if he was in the majority, right, not coming from a family with proper education or proper finances, the thing to do was to get the kid to take out a loan in his senior year so he could buy a brand new truck. And once he had that truck, they had him hooked forever. And the other thing, which I came upon and researched myself, was in our little community, there were no jobs. So kids coming up, men coming up, boys coming up, one of the few alternatives for them, easy alternative, was to enlist the army. So I'm looking at things like that and I'm thinking these things are deliberate on somebody's part. Somebody's you're telling me that the idea with the high school seniors to get them to buy a pickup truck, you got them on the hook for the next 4 years or so. That's pretty sophisticated. That's not random. That's not that kid's desire to be part of the herd.
I agree with all that, but I think maybe it sounded a little more like Sartre here than like Nietzsche, but it's like the illusion of choice. Like, okay, you've bought this bright, shiny red truck. You feel really good about that. You look how much autonomy you've got. You've made a decision, right? But it's a forced choice. It's a manipulated choice. And I would say a lot of the things that look to us like autonomy, that look to us like we're free agents as Americans in this nice Western, relatively comfortable Western society we live in, are actually false choices that were imposed on us. And that's not real autonomy. And that is, I think Nietzsche would agree with almost everything you said there, that's not real freedom.
But it's not. Go ahead.
And I think Nietzsche would even go further. Brendan, I've read some of the same books as you, and so when I read things like Dark Money or Democracy in Chains, in which the authors are chronicling, which, for lack of a better word, is essentially a plot to shape this country how they see fit, I think Nietzsche might say two things on that. One is, I think he might find something in that praiseworthy, in that here you have these people manifesting their desires to affect a large outcome in the world. But I think also he might say something a bit contradictory, which is that this is what you get when you let rationality run amok, right? Because you have these people identifying an outcome and without it being tempered by any sense in morality, wherever you derive that morality from. And I think you're seeing, as a result of that, just in my opinion, a lot of really terrible tragedies that affect this country. And I think that that's one of the consequences of letting rationality run amok.
I would say I agree with everything you just said. I would add to it, though, that what I think Nietzsche would say, the people that are being oppressed in some sense in that way, or manipulated in some way, I think he would say not to underestimate the human spirit. Like that, the human spirit, that exertiveness will continue to exert itself every time. And we've seen this throughout history. Every time, you start to oppress a group of people, there's always someone to push back in some way, shape, or form. That counter exertiveness will continue to happen. And no matter how much you oppress or manipulate people, someone's going to be subversive and try to change things.
And I think one thing that's even more interesting about that we haven't necessarily touched on is that I forget the quote exactly and in which work he did it, but I remember Nietzsche writing something to the effect of that he almost wished adversity and struggle and toil upon the people whom he loved. And he said it so poetically. I remember
where it is either, but I know what you're alluding to, but I can't place it.
And he would say, because that is the thing. He wishes upon the people, all the sufferings, all the toilings, all the troubles that they might have, because that is essentially the thing that would show anybody that the greatest aspect of the human spirit is that it endures and that it can improve. And so
he's also as a result, he's also very critical of just the affluence and decadence of modern life. We have all that. We're not out there struggling in nature trying to feed ourselves. We're pretty well fed no matter how well we eat, and we don't have to work very much. It's not like it used to be when we were out living in the plains of Africa. Right? So we have a fairly decadent society, and a lot of the things we prioritize or think are really important morally or politically or for our civilization are actually themselves kind of a sign of decadence for Nietzsche. He's very critical of decadence.
And he had that position and admires someone like Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte. Don't you see those as contradictory things?
Why would I? Help me out here. Why would I?
Well,
I think you're drawing a contradiction between the decadent lifestyle and the admiration for. I think Nietzsche perhaps is
just the decadence of being a ruler, like the opulence of being a monarch. Is that what you have in mind there?
Yeah, well, Rome in its heyday was not a very nice place. It was fairly decadent by anybody's standards. Yet in terms of Julius Caesar, one of the emperors, how do you look at him and have any admiration for him, and then look at the society that he was literally.
Yeah, I just think it's because, Julius Caesar was, had to come in from without, so to speak, work his way up the ranks and come
I
march
mean, I
in,
mean, certainly Nietzsche
Hitler was a
very
private or a
visual.
corporal in World War One, right? He was in the trenches. He worked himself up from the ranks. I don't know that Napoleon had any great claim to fame.
Yeah, I wish I was more of a historian that way. I'm not. But.
Well,
The one thing I'd like to tease out a little bit more, though, just on Nietzsche's point on suffering, is that I think you kind of see this play out in 2001 when I'm going to butcher. I think it's Dave at the end who turns into the space.
Dave, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where he finally, I don't even know what you want to call it, arrives in this ascended realm where he sees himself go through his life, and to some extent that's not, well, at least I say this, on his way there, it is certainly, based on what I saw in the movie, not a pleasurable experience. He's being contorted and showing all these flashing lights and crazy images, and then he ends up in this unfamiliar place, and he sees himself age. He steps outside of himself, and then he sees himself die on a bed, and he dies himself. And it's only after going through what I think is fair to characterize as a torturous and miserable experience, and dealing with that he ascends into what, I guess, if you want to look at it through a Nietzsche lens, the Ubermensch, or the Overman. And so I think that, to the extent we want to tease out any more connections between Nietzsche and 2001, you see that the path to, becoming your best self, manifesting yourself in the best way that you can in this world, is through adversity and confronting painful things.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche generally thinks we've consciously or unconsciously blinded ourselves to who we really are. Like, we don't look at ourselves in the mirror very much, either our psychology or our evolutionary history, or the mere fact that we're biological beings with all that goes with that, when we think of ourselves as this consciousness that's going to go to heaven someday if you're religious. So he really wants us to look at ourselves in the mirror in a way that we tend not to. Well, I had more to say about that. What was I going to say? And I guess when I wrote that article about 2001 and Nietzsche, I also invoked Heidegger, because I think one thing we're constantly doing is projecting ourselves into the future. You do see yourself as an old person someday. Like, Brendan, you're older than us. You're living it now. But when you were 40, you were probably like, hey, I got to plan ahead for when I'm 70. And we are constantly projecting ourselves into the future, thinking about different possibilities, thinking about what matters to us, thinking about choices, thinking about projects, thinking about relationship, whatever it is, everything that matters about life. You're always projecting yourself into the future. So I actually took a slightly more Heideggerian spin on that scene, where it's just Dave Bowman kind of stepping back, looking at his life somewhat objectively, projecting himself into the future. And because of that kind of, just openness to himself in a way that most of us never really have, that's what allows him to finally transcend the things that have limited humans in general. It's what allows him to genuinely explore future possibilities.
You each see that differently. I just saw him, and maybe because I'm old by my standards, a lot of my day are things coming into my consciousness from my past.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's a consequence of my age or my particular orientation, but I see him just reflecting upon his life and getting a sense of his life. And then when he has that, putting that in a larger context, there's a bigger thing here than the planet Earth. And maybe if you deal with that in 2001, and this is alien civilization, and he's coming in contact with it, and he happens to come in contact with it on Jupiter. But if you look at the monolith, first it appears on the Earth, and then it disappears. They find it again, or a similar one on the moon, and it's really like a beacon going out, right? And they go to Jupiter, and that's where it is. That's where the mother lode is. Well, I could envision some other science fiction writer coming up with, travels to yet another galaxy where the concept that you come away with in 2001 seems, pastoral by comparison.
I guess
right?
the space baby scene is interesting because I think, for a lot of people who take the cosmic perspective on life, you can start to go, wow, look how insignificant humans are. Look how tiny our planet is. The pale blue dot from Carl Sagan, right? Look how insignificant we are in the cosmic scheme of things. That could very easily lead you to nihilism. Like nothing matters, right? We're so insignificant. But that's not the direction Nietzsche goes with that. He might start out there in that essay that I sent you guys on truth and lies in a non-moral sense, but he doesn't end up there. He ends up emphasizing subjective meaning. And it's, there's a cosmic perspective in 2001 A Space Odyssey, but it's not cold and nihilistic at the end. I don't think it seems beautiful and full of hope and possibilities. And it's somewhat optimistic, right? So how do you reconcile that cosmic perspective where we do seem tiny and insignificant with the fact that there's this positive spin on it by the end of the movie? I think that's a very Nietzschean notion there, that we can be objectively insignificant but full of subjective meaning at the same time.
Nietzsche is not the author of 2001.
No, but I think it's a Nietzschean thread that's there in the movie.
Someone chose to lay a Nietzschean.
Maybe it's again, maybe it's it's hermeneutic thread. I don't know if the Kubrick meant that when he put it in there or not. I have no idea, but it's there for me nonetheless. So. And this is the thing about Nietzsche, that it's exciting and it's frustrating at the same time, because you constantly want to pin him down and say, Nietzsche, what the hell do you really mean? Can't you just, give me the straight scoop? And, at time and again, he wants himself and all of us as readers to find our own interpretations of things. So it would not bother Nietzsche in the slightest that's my take on 2001 A Space Odyssey, and you've got your take on 2001 A Space Odyssey.
I had no desire to pin him down to anything. I guess
you did though. You're like, just lay it out, Nietzsche. What do you?
No,
how are you?
No,
can't you be more prescriptive with us?
My thing on Nietzsche is, I think Nietzsche is a dangerous mind. I think Nietzsche Nietzsche certainly became psychotic.
I agree with you, and not for the reason you think, though. The reason I agree with you is that I think philosophy in general is dangerous, and I think its origins are dangerous from the very beginning. I think there's a reason that some of the early schools of philosophy were from Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum. They were somewhat exclusive, right? They weren't for any old Joe to come on in there and philosophize. There was kind of a Gnostic quality to it, an insider quality, given that it's kind of dangerous. It can be really self-destructive to start deconstructing your life and deconstructing morality and deconstructing politics and deconstructing the world around you, unless you can handle it somewhat responsibly. And I think all of philosophy has that kind of esoteric quality, and it's a little dangerous for people who can't wield it responsibly. I agree with that.
I'm forever into the practical.
I'm almost forever in the abstract. That's fine.
Okay, right. So, but I've spent a good deal of my life working with pained people.
Mm-hmm.
And their way out of pain was through the practical,
mm-hmm.
not through the philosophical. The philosophical was not where they needed to be going. They needed to be going into
that's interesting and counterintuitive to me, because intuitively I would say when you focus on the practical, you're so drawn into the minutia of the things that are wrong in life. It's when you step back and go, hey, let's just put it in a slightly broader perspective here, that you can get some peace about things. So for me, the abstract actually plays that role. That's a short
poem called Autobiography in 5 Chapters. Have you read that by any chance?
No.
I will email you a copy of it. Just that's what I mean by practical. If something doesn't work, try something else. Be flexible. And when you get into, with some people who get into philosophy, they have no ability to be flexible. And if you're talking about Christian theology as it's come to be known today, for instance, it can be rather inflexible.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's as much philosophy as any of the philosophers we're reading.
Yeah, and maybe it's just age, because when everyone's young, they're always a little sophomoric when they're young, right? But by the time they come to my intro to philosophy class, I'm completely disturbed at how rigid some of these 18, 19, 20-year-olds really are. Like they already think they've got it all figured out. They've got all their assumptions about the meaning of life and morality, and it's all just kind of connected together and wrapped together in a nice little package for them, and it's palatable, and it's very positive and palatable in a very Nietzschean kind of way. But it's bothersome how naively simple it is, and how rigid they are about this little package that they've been handed. And it's not a package they figured out themselves, it's a package that's been handed to them. And that is Nietzsche doesn't find that praiseworthy, and I doubt you find that praiseworthy.
No, when I first taught in a college environment, I remember going my first class, I thought, this is going to be heaven. I'm at Stony Brook University. It's just going to be people with open minds, people who are willing to consider things, and that's not what I found. So that was a kind of a rude awakening. I ended up structuring my class differently than I originally intended to, because I realized that I've got something else to deal with here. There's another reality that needs to be addressed first.
I may be the Napoleon of the classroom.
No. I told my students, interesting word, but I told them that if they waste a minute of time worrying about me or what I thought, they were wasting their time in the class. I told them that that in the class that I was doing, they would either get an A or they'd get an F. And they would get an A if they simply came to class, and they'd get an F if they didn't come to class. And beyond that, it was up to them what they derived. When I graduated, I was in the master's program, and the day before commencement, right, for the master's program, Sandy Kravitz was the dean of the school, and he wasn't going to be there. And another professor was going to speak on behalf of Sandy. And we got together in his office, three or four of us, and we were just talking. And I said to him, you're doing this tomorrow? He said, yes. I said, why don't you do something different? And he said, oh, what would you do? And I said, I think I'd tell him that this is all bullshit. That what, if we were really honest, the goal of the school, or the stated message, was social change. And if we were really interested in social change, we just take people and give them advanced degrees so they could get certified and go out there and do whatever they wanted to, and not in any way, shape, or form indoctrinate them. But by making them go through things, pass tests, and do that, we were ensuring that they were going to conform. And for whatever it's worth, the next day, that's exactly what he said.
So Brandon, I have to point out, I feel obligated to point out that I think you might be a closet Nietzschean, because so much of what you say is Nietzschean in quality, like this notion that students should not care what you, the teacher, thinks. That's probably a Nietzschean concept. Just be yourself. The whole notion that there are so many contexts in life in which we're not free to say what we really think, professional or academic or whatnot. Think how few places in life you're actually able to say what you really think unconstrained, right? But you think it's a value to be able to do that. Yeah. So you are kind of sounding a lot like Nietzsche in ways that maybe you don't see.
But I believe in good and evil.
Yeah, and Nietzsche doesn't. Nietzsche believes in strong and weak, but good and evil he thinks is a fabrication. Yes.
Well, I don't. That's strong and weak are, I don't know, a lot of ways. I believe in good and evil. Nick used to say, Nick is making his eyebrows firm. Nick would say, what do you believe in death? And I would say, no. And he'd say, what are you talking about? I made him crazy. I really made Nick crazy. And I'd say, I don't know death. All I know is life. So the only thing I have to believe in is life. And he said, well, what happens after you die? I said, there you go. You're using this word I have no meaning for. What happens after you say I die or someone else says I die? I don't have a clue. I could cease. I could go on to something else. It could be Groundhog Day. What do I know and what do I care? All I know is life, and that's all I believe in. So this, but what I would also say is that we have some responsibility to each other, and that there is, in my opinion, independent of whether or not there's a divine being or a super being or anything else, there are good things and there are bad things. The causing pain and misery is a bad thing. Inflicting pain on another creature is a bad thing. So I think you have some responsibility, whatever direction you want to choose for yourself, fine. But I guess do no harm.
Yeah, and I guess Nietzsche has zeroed in on what he thinks of as a slightly different bad thing. It's not, pain and suffering, but it's the repression of our human individuality and spirit, for culturally and politically and whatnot. And that's the thing that Nietzsche thinks that's something Nietzsche thinks is bad. That's bad that we're that repressed as a society. But
in a Nietzschean vein, saying what I truly think, I am going to have to bow out in a few minutes because
Okay.
I do. Yeah, let's bring this to a close. But I do want to say, like, at the very end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Brandon, you said that, one thing that's made get you just to see things from a different perspective, get you to step back and see things either from a cosmic perspective, or if you look at it in turn on the time vector, get you to see possibilities for the future. I think, there's this fundamental Nietzschean concept that the way things are today, they weren't always that way. They're somewhat invented. They don't have to be that way as a result. So if that movie gets us to see any different possibilities for how the future could be, it's kind of like Star Trek. You get out of there in the stars and you can imagine humanity in the future, all the ways that it could be, that it could be better, it could be worse in some ways, but it doesn't have to be the way it is today. We can make it something better if we want to in the future. I think that in itself is Nietzschean in tone and in substance. So
Star Trek, very moralistic.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does waffle on that point. Sometimes it's very relativistic and sometimes it's very, very moralistic. Yeah, it really depends on the episode.
So we've come to an end here.
I think so. I think I covered everything on my list. We didn't spend as much time talking about 2001 as I thought we might, but that's okay because I think we did touch on a lot of the threads. We talked about the evolutionary thread. We talked about the biology thread. We talked about culture. We talked about technology, rationality run amok. We talked about Ubermensch. We covered a lot of Nietzschean ground, even though we didn't spend as much time talking about the movie as I thought we might. So good job to all of us.
If anybody wants to get together and do this again on a slightly different topic, I'm up for it. I enjoyed this. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for the invite. I'm glad you stumbled on my blog post. I'm glad, what I appreciate about you guys in particular, there are really not that many people that really enjoy talking about just ideas, speculative ideas even. We live a very pragmatic kind of life in today's day and age, and it's nice to find people, honestly, who just want to talk about ideas for their own sake. So I appreciate it.
Well,
same here.
Maybe we can do it again. Who knows?
I'm sure we will.
Well, if you come up with something, reach out. And I guess I will reach out as well. Nick, you're the quiet one here tonight.
Yeah, I got this dog that I'm paying attention to. after coming off a shift at the office, it's maybe a weekend might be better for me where I'm a little more fresh.
All right. Well, anyway, thank you, Zach.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the invite. So you guys have a good night.
Take care.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night.